Welcome back to The Last Walk. Across America's forests, countless people have vanished without warning. Today, we're looking at the most terrifying disappearances that still leave more questions than answers. From a photographer who chased one last shot into a strange fog, to a lifeguard who dove into water that had quietly turned into a deadly trap. It was the 18th of October, 2022, and the ridges were at the very peak of their autumn color, the busiest and most beautiful stretch of the year in the most visited national park in America. The morning came in cold and gray and still, the raw kind of autumn day serious photographers quietly pray for. Aaron Knipe, 29 and a dedicated amateur photographer from Asheville, had come up with two friends to chase exactly that light along one of the park's most popular ridgeline trails, a route so busy and well-worn that it feels no more dangerous than a crowded overlook. He was not reckless. He was fit, he had done this exact trail before, and he stayed with the group through most of the morning. But the fog that day was extraordinary, thick and moving and lit from behind by a hidden sun, pouring over the ridge in slow waves, the same haze that gives the Smokies their name, exactly the kind of thing he had come all that way to capture. A little past midday, at a bend where the trail ran along the top of a steep, laurel-choked slope, Aaron told his friends he wanted to get just a few steps off the path for a clean shot down into the fog. He told them to head on slowly and that he would catch them in 5 minutes. It was the last time anyone saw him. When he still had not caught up after 20 minutes, his friends turned back. They stood at the bend and called his name and heard nothing but the steady drip of the fog off the leaves. They could see the exact spot where he had eased through the laurel, one snapped branch at the edge of the drop, and below it, a slope that fell away into a green tangle so thick they could not see more than a body length into it. On a flat rock right beside the trail sat his lens cap, set down and forgotten. That was the entire scene. One broken branch, a lens cap, and a wall of fog. They spent a frantic hour pushing a few feet into the laurel and shouting before one of them ran the trail back to find a signal and call it in. Those two friends were the last people to see Aaron alive, and their account, the branch, the lens cap, and the 5 minutes he had promised became the entire starting point for everyone who came after. Rangers took them back to the bend again and again to pin down the exact spot, but in fog that thick, even the people who had been standing right there could no longer agree on where he had slipped through. The thing about a laurel hell I had trouble understanding at first is that it's not a forest you move through, it's a trap that you climb into, and every way back out is a disaster waiting to occur. The last images later pulled from his camera told almost nothing and somehow everything. The final frames are just walls of soft white fog with the faint dark line of the slope falling away below, and each one is a step or two lower than the one before it, as though he had kept easing downhill for one more angle and then one more after that, chasing the light down into the tangle until the camera simply stops. The search that followed was one of the larger operations of that season. The National Park Service brought in scent dogs, county rescue squads from both Tennessee and North Carolina, trained volunteer search teams, and a helicopter that could do little more than check the exposed cliffs and drainages where a person might be visible from above, since the hardwood canopy hid everything beneath it. For more than a week, more than 70 searchers worked the slope below that bend in careful grid lines, the whole effort run under a formal incident command, every completed search sector documented and mapped before crews were reassigned. And here is the detail that has stayed with everyone who worked it. They were almost certainly passing right over him. The laurel was so dense that teams crawling on their hands and knees could come within a few feet of something and never see it, and the tangle kept funneling searchers back out onto easier ground because no one could believe a grown man had gotten far into terrain that vicious. Dogs lost the scent in the wet, the fog came and went for days. Slowly, the search wound down and the trail reopened, and hundreds of people a week began passing that quiet bend with no idea what lay just below it. It is worth sitting for a moment with just how strange that failure was, because it is the heart of why this case still gets talked about. This was not a search that missed some far corner of the wilderness. By the time Rangers reached the scene, they knew almost exactly where Aaron had stepped off the trail, and still, with dozens of trained searchers, dogs, and a helicopter that could barely see through the canopy, working an area the size of a few city blocks, the ground gave up nothing. The laurel did that. On that slope, the rhododendron grows in interlocking layers 8 to 10 feet thick in places, the branches bent downhill by decades of snow into a springy, chest-high lattice that has to be fought for every single yard. A searcher can be waist deep in it, a body length from the person they are looking for, and see nothing but leaves, scent pools and drifts in the wet, and lies to the dogs. That is the trap, and Aaron had followed his camera straight into the center of it, one soft frame at a time. And because no one in that fog ever realized the slope ended in a sheer drop, the ground below the rock face went unsearched entirely, which is how a man a quarter-mile from the trail stayed lost until spring. Aaron was found the following spring by a park biologist working off-trail on a survey. He was less than a quarter-mile from the bend where he had stepped off the path. At the foot of a sheer rock face the fog had hidden completely, a drop of some 40 feet where the slope simply ended just past the last of the laurel. The medical examiner determined that he had died of multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a fall from height, the drop far past anything a person could have survived. Investigators believed he had kept easing after the light, one careful step at a time, watching the shot instead of the ground. Until he reached the lip of a drop, the fog had hidden completely. In fog that thick, there would have been no way to see that the slope had ended until it already had. Aaron told them to go on, so I hope his friends can forgive themselves one day. Nobody could have looked at that quiet bend and known it was the last thing he would ever ask of them. Buffalo, Wyoming sits right at the eastern edge of the Bighorn Mountains, and it's the kind of place where people have always had a close connection with the land around them. It's a small town, just a little over 4,000 people, and a lot of everyday life there has been shaped by ranching, oil field work, and of course, hunting season. And every year around late September, you start to see the same thing happen. Pickup trucks loaded with coolers, tents, camping gear, and rifle cases begin making their way west out of town toward the mountains. For a lot of locals, heading into the Bighorns isn't some rare adventure. It's just something people have been doing for generations. I love that image, honestly. It's not some big production or a once-in-a-lifetime event for these people. It's just a normal part of their everyday lives. The Bighorns are deceptive in that way. From a distance, the mountains can look open and approachable, but once you enter the backcountry, the landscape becomes much more complicated. Drainages twist through the forest, ridgelines block visibility, and the landscape can quickly make even familiar areas difficult to navigate. In terrain like that, being only a short distance away from a search team does not always mean being easy to find. And that's the thing about the Bighorns. Even people who know these mountains well understand they can still be dangerous. Experience helps, but changing weather, difficult terrain, and isolation can turn a familiar landscape into a dangerous one very quickly. The line about knowing something your whole life but never fully predicting it, I felt that one, and it's going to matter a lot here. Every fall, hunters head into the Bighorns knowing there are risks out there. And most of the time, everything goes exactly as planned. They go in, they hunt, and they come back home. But every now and then, something happens that reminds everyone just how unforgiving these mountains can be. In the spring of 2023, a combination of erosion, seasonal snowmelt, and unstable terrain likely contributed to a landslide in a remote drainage of the Bighorn Mountains. The slide altered a section of terrain that had been searched nearly a decade earlier, exposing areas that had previously been covered by rock and soil. Weeks later, once conditions allowed safe access, a Forest Service field crew entered the area to assess the damage and document how the landscape had changed. Their work involved examining displaced rock, erosion patterns, and changes to drainage features, routine assessments used to understand how natural events affect forest conditions and potential hazards. While documenting the disturbed area, a member of the Forest Service crew noticed material that appeared to be human remains among the displaced soil and rock. I can't imagine being that person out there doing routine erosion work, and suddenly you're not doing that job anymore. The crew immediately stopped work, secured the area, and contacted local authorities rather than disturbing the site further. Nearby, investigators recovered a heavily corroded hunting rifle and fragments of outdoor equipment consistent with a backcountry hunting trip. Although much of the material had deteriorated after years underground, some remaining items helped investigators identify a possible connection to Chervy. At first, the crew could not know how long the remains had been exposed or who they belonged to. In remote areas, discoveries like this require investigators to work carefully, documenting the scene before anything is moved. The location of the remains, surrounding debris, and any objects found nearby could all help reconstruct what happened years earlier. Word of the discovery moved through Buffalo quickly, once authorities confirmed that human remains had been found in that particular drainage. For a town like Buffalo, where many residents have strong connections to the surrounding mountains, news of the discovery quickly drew attention. It did not take long for people to connect the remains to one of the area's unresolved missing person cases. It took forensic analysis and DNA testing conducted by the Wyoming State Medical Examiner's Office to move from suspicion to confirmation. The results established that the remains belonged to Chervy Dawson, a hunter who had vanished into that same drainage in the fall of 2013 at the age of 47. By all accounts, Chervy was the kind of person who seemed rooted to Buffalo. He had spent most of his life there, growing up on a cattle ranch northwest of town before eventually building a career as an equipment mechanic. People who knew him described someone dependable and unassuming, the sort of man who showed up, did his work, and rarely drew attention to himself. Friends and relatives said he had been comfortable outdoors for as long as they could remember. Hunting had been part of his life since he was young, and by 2013, he had spent years returning to the same areas of the Bighorn Mountains. Those who knew Chervy described him as practical, patient, and self-reliant, someone who worked through problems carefully and took preparation seriously. He was not known as someone who chased unnecessary risks or made impulsive decisions in the backcountry. This is exactly the guy you'd think would be fine out there, which honestly makes it harder for me to hear. For someone who had lived in Buffalo most of his life, the Bighorns were less an unfamiliar wilderness than a landscape he had come to know through years of experience. He was divorced by then, though those close to him said the separation had not been marked by major conflict. He remained close with his adult son, and hunting was one of the interests they continued to share. Those who knew Chervy said he was careful about letting others know where he planned to be and when he expected to return. Investigators found no evidence indicating that Chervy had intentionally disappeared. That reputation would become one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. When word spread that Chervy had failed to return from a hunting trip, many of the people who knew him struggled to understand how someone so experienced and familiar with the terrain could simply disappear. I keep coming back to that. Everyone agrees he was the careful one, and yet here we are. The hunting trip Chervy began in October 2013 was not unusual for him. Family members said he often set aside time each fall to hunt elk in the Bighorn Mountains, returning to areas he had come to know through years of experience. According to those close to him, he had spent time in the mountains earlier that season and planned to return for a longer trip once elk season was underway. The area where he intended to hunt was located deep in the Bighorns, at elevations approaching 9,500 feet. Reaching it required traveling along a rough four-wheel drive road before continuing on foot into increasingly steep terrain. Maps, search records, and later accounts from rescue personnel describe the area as heavily forested, with dense stands of lodgepole pine broken by narrow drainages and rocky slopes that could be difficult to navigate even in good conditions. The terrain itself would become a recurring topic during the search. Search and rescue personnel later noted that parts of the drainage contained unstable talus fields and steep canyon walls, features that complicated both ground searches and aerial observation. Visibility was often limited by the landscape, making it difficult to see very far in any direction despite being in open mountain country. Weather was another concern. Archived forecasts from mid-October show nighttime temperatures in the high country falling well below freezing, while advisories issued later that week warned of deteriorating conditions and possible snowfall at higher elevations. In a region where weather can shift quickly, even experienced hunters understood that conditions could change dramatically over the course of a single day. Like much of the backcountry in the Bighorns, the area also lacked reliable cell coverage. Any emergency call for help would have been difficult to make, and assistance, if requested, would have taken considerable time to arrive. No cell coverage, plus talus fields, plus freezing nights, that combination alone is enough to worry me before anything even happens to him. As the search unfolded, investigators and rescue personnel would repeatedly point to the combination of rugged terrain, isolation, and changing weather as some of the most significant challenges facing anyone traveling through that part of the range. On the morning of October 14th, 2013, before heading into the backcountry, Chervy stopped by the Buffalo Ranger District Office, just like he had done during previous hunting trips. Before leaving Buffalo, he checked the conditions in the area and let people close to him know his planned route and when he expected to return. I always find moments like this interesting because it shows how normal everything felt at the time. Just someone doing the usual preparation before a trip. At the time, those details probably didn't seem important, but later on, once the search began, they would become some of the key pieces of information investigators relied on. And really, nothing about what Chervy shared that morning stood out as unusual. It was just what an experienced hunter would normally do before heading into the mountains. He had taken these kinds of precautions before, and this trip seemed no different. After leaving the ranger station, Chervy drove toward a trailhead that hunters commonly use to access that part of the Bighorn Mountains. As investigators started looking into what happened, they began piecing together Chervy's final known movements, using information he had shared before the trip and evidence later found in the mountains. Investigators later used the information he left behind, including his planned route and return date, to establish where he had entered the backcountry and where search efforts needed to begin. Along with the route and return information he had shared beforehand, these details gave investigators some of the clearest indications of where Chervy was and where he intended to go before he disappeared. From the trailhead, Chervy traveled several miles into the drainage before establishing his base camp in a clearing partially sheltered by surrounding timber. When search teams later located the site, they found his tent, food supplies, and equipment still in place. The camp showed that Chervy had entered the area as planned and prepared for a multi-day hunt, but it offered few answers about what happened after he left. There were no immediate signs of a disturbance that explained why he failed to return. I think there's something strangely quiet about seeing a campsite like this. All the gear still there, everything set up, but the person who brought it there is gone. What happened during the following days remains less certain. Investigators were able to establish where Chervy had planned to hunt, but the exact details of his movements after leaving camp were never fully known. Without direct witnesses or a complete record of his route, much of the timeline had to be reconstructed from the evidence left behind, the surrounding terrain, and information provided by people familiar with his hunting habits. On October 16th, 2 days into the trip, Chervy made a scheduled check-in with his longtime hunting partner, Russell Kepler. The two had arranged to stay in contact during the hunt, as they had on previous trips. Russell later told investigators that he had spoken with Chervy during that check-in. According to Russell's account, Chervy said he had spotted a bull elk moving through a canyon area away from his base camp and planned to follow it before losing daylight. For Russell, the conversation did not immediately stand out as unusual. He later described Chervy as sounding like he normally did during hunting trips, focused on the hunt and interested in the opportunity he had found. There was no indication during the exchange that Chervy was dealing with an emergency or believed he was in immediate danger. It would become the last confirmed communication anyone had with Chervy. He sounds completely normal on that call, just a guy excited about a bull elk, and that's honestly the hardest part for me to sit with. Several days passed without another check-in. Because Chervy was known to spend extended periods alone in the backcountry, and communication from remote mountain terrain could be inconsistent, Russell initially believed the silence might simply be the result of difficult conditions or limited signal coverage. That changed when October 21st arrived, the return date Chervy had given before leaving, and there was still no sign of him. His truck hadn't come back, and Russell hadn't received any message saying that Chervy was planning to stay longer or change his plans. And that was when the situation started to feel different. Based on what Russell knew about Chervy, this wasn't something he would normally do. Chervy was experienced, he was careful, and he understood the importance of letting people know where he was going and when he expected to be back. I can picture Russell just staring at that empty spot where the truck should be, and that's the moment that it stops being nothing. So Russell contacted the sheriff's office and the Forest Service. He provided them with everything he had: Chervy's planned route, his expected return date, details from their last conversation, and the canyon area Chervy had mentioned while talking about the elk he had seen. Those details, at the time, were some of the only clues available, but they would soon become the starting point for the search that followed. Search and rescue operations began after Russell reported that Chervy had failed to return. With information about his planned hunting area, a known base camp location, and details from that final check-in, search teams had a starting point for where to focus their efforts. Over the following days, the intensive search expanded to include ground crews, aerial searches, and volunteers from local search and rescue organizations, hunting communities, and people who knew Chervy personally. Search teams worked outward from the information they had: his planned route, his base camp location, and the area he had mentioned during his final conversation with Russell. The terrain itself made the search extremely challenging. Crews had to move through steep drainages, dense forest, and areas of uneven rock where visibility was limited. In some sections, searchers could cover only a small amount of ground each day because the landscape required them to move carefully over unstable slopes, thick vegetation, and areas where a person could be hidden only a short distance away. Search teams also faced the difficulty of knowing where to focus their efforts. They had Chervy's last known location, his planned hunting area, and the canyon he mentioned, but no confirmed route showing exactly how he traveled after leaving camp. In a landscape made up of countless gullies, ridges, and pockets of dense timber, even an experienced hunter could disappear into terrain that looked much smaller on a map than it felt on the ground. In the weeks that followed, crews continued targeted searches through the drainage and surrounding terrain, focusing on areas where an experienced hunter might have traveled. Search efforts were adjusted based on the evidence available, but without additional clues or a confirmed location, investigators were left with a large and difficult area to cover. Searchers first found Chervy's truck at the trailhead, where it was still parked and appeared undisturbed. There were no obvious signs that he had left in a hurry or that something had happened around the vehicle. As the search moved farther into the drainage, they eventually reached his base camp. The tent was still standing, and his gear and supplies were still there: food, sleeping equipment, and other items you would expect to see from someone planning to spend several days hunting in the area. And that detail was important. The condition of the camp suggested that Shervy had probably left it at some point during the trip, rather than simply packing up and leaving the mountains. But beyond that, the site didn't really provide many answers about where he went next. Seeing that tent still standing with his gear untouched, that's almost worse than finding nothing at all. Later, search teams working outward from the camp found a set of boot impressions near the entrance of the canyon Shervy had mentioned during his last conversation with Russell. Investigators noted that the impressions appeared consistent with the size and tread pattern of Shervy's boots, although they could not confirm his exact path or determine what happened after that point. The impressions continued toward the canyon before eventually disappearing in an area of exposed rock and loose talus. Unfortunately, that kind of terrain does not preserve tracks well. From there, searchers no longer had a clear trail to follow. He appears to be heading toward the same canyon area he mentioned to Russell, and then the ground itself just stops telling anyone anything. Canine search teams and aircraft supported the search effort, although the steep terrain, dense vegetation, and limited visibility made aerial and ground searches challenging. Despite the continued search efforts by professional rescuers, volunteers, and people familiar with the landscape, no additional signs of Shervy were located. No clothing, equipment, or remains were found that could explain what happened after he entered the canyon. Investigators considered several possible explanations for Shervy's disappearance based on the evidence available at the time. A fall or accident in the canyon was one of the leading possibilities, given the steep terrain, exposed rock, and difficult conditions in the area where he was last believed to have traveled. Weather was another concern. Temperatures in the high country could drop well below freezing at night, and changing conditions during that time of year added another layer of risk for anyone traveling alone in the mountains. Officials also considered the possibility of a wildlife encounter, although there was no evidence at the time pointing directly toward one. Without recovered remains, personal equipment, or additional evidence beyond the tracks near the canyon, investigators could not determine exactly what had happened. After weeks of searching with no new leads, the active operation was eventually scaled back, leaving the case unresolved. For Shervy's family and friends, the end of the search brought no clear explanation, only the knowledge that somewhere in the Bighorn Mountains, he had disappeared without leaving behind enough evidence to tell them why. Weeks of searching, and all they have is a set of tracks that just vanish. In the years that followed, Shervy's disappearance became a lingering mystery in and around Buffalo. Like many unresolved cases in close-knit communities, people continued to search for explanations even when investigators had few answers to offer. Some believe the most likely explanation was the mountain itself. They pointed to the steep terrain, remote location, and difficult conditions in the Bighorns as enough to explain how an experienced hunter could disappear without leaving behind obvious evidence. Others in the community discussed different possibilities, including whether Shervy might have encountered another person in the backcountry. Over time, various theories circulated among people familiar with the area, including possibilities involving other people being present in the backcountry. However, investigators found no evidence connecting anyone else to Shervy's disappearance. A smaller number of people questioned whether Shervy could have chosen to leave voluntarily, though investigators found no evidence supporting that theory. Like the other possibilities raised over the years, it remained speculation rather than an explanation. Ultimately, none of these theories produced new leads, and Shervy's disappearance remained unresolved. What remained consistent in the years after Shervy disappeared was his son's determination to keep searching for answers. In interviews over the years, he spoke about returning to the Bighorn Mountains and revisiting areas connected to his father's disappearance, hoping that something missed during the original search might eventually provide a clue. His continued searches reflected his hope that, eventually, something might finally explain what happened to his father. Every time he went back into the mountains, he carried that same uncertainty with him, the feeling that maybe something had been missed, or that some small piece of evidence was still out there waiting to be found. A son going back year after year into the exact mountains that took his father. I don't know how you carry that, but he did it anyway. But year after year, the Bighorns stayed quiet. For nearly a decade, there were no new answers, and Shervy's disappearance remained an open mystery despite the searches and efforts to find him. Then, in the spring of 2023, that silence was finally broken. A natural event in the mountains exposed a section of terrain that had remained hidden for years, leading to a discovery that would finally bring answers to Shervy's family. During the response to the landslide, a Forest Service crew discovered human remains in the area. The remains were later identified through forensic analysis and DNA testing as belonging to Shervy Dawson. Following that identification, the case was reviewed by forensic investigators and medical authorities. The examination found skeletal injuries consistent with a significant traumatic event, supporting the possibility that Chervy died from an accident, such as a fall. However, after nearly a decade in the mountain environment, the condition of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact circumstances surrounding his death. Investigators found no evidence suggesting that another person had been involved in Chervy's death. The forensic examination also did not uncover findings that supported the theories of foul play or a planned disappearance that had circulated in the years after he went missing. 10 years of theories about other people or him just walking away, and it came back to the explanation investigators had never been able to prove: a likely accident in steep terrain. Using the forensic findings, Russell Kepler's account of Chervy's final communication, and the possible boot impressions documented during the original 2013 search, investigators developed a likely explanation based on the evidence that remained available. Taken together, the available evidence suggested that Chervy likely traveled toward the canyon area mentioned during his final conversation and may have suffered a fatal accident in the surrounding terrain. The injuries identified during the forensic examination were consistent with such an accident, while the location of the remains within the disturbed terrain was consistent with the possibility that natural processes, including erosion and slope movement, had altered the area over time. However, the exact circumstances of his final moments could never be determined. The discovery also helped explain why the original search had not located him. Over nearly a decade, natural changes in the terrain, including erosion, shifting debris, and seasonal movement of rock and soil, may have altered the area enough that evidence remained hidden until the landslide exposed it. It was only after the 2023 landslide altered the terrain that investigators were able to locate remains connected to Chervy's disappearance. It was the 9th of April, 2015, and the backcountry was still shaking off winter, the creeks running high and cold with snowmelt, and the nights on the high ridges dropping well below freezing. The park sprawls across more than 500,000 acres of ridge and gorge along the Tennessee and North Carolina line, and the route ahead ran deep into the emptiest part of it, hours on foot from the nearest paved road. Grant Ledbetter, 34 and from Knoxville, was the most experienced person in any of these stories. A careful, seasoned backpacker who had done long solo trips for the better part of a decade, who filed a rough plan with a friend back home and picked up his backcountry permit exactly like he was supposed to. He knew what he was doing. On his second evening, he reached one of the park's backcountry shelters, and it is here that the record stops being guesswork, because 3 other backpackers were staying there that night, a couple and a young man traveling on his own. He was the kind of backpacker who laminated his maps and carried a paper backup of everything, who had bailed off trips before when the weather turned, and whom friends trusted so completely that when he went quiet on a trip, nobody thought twice. They all remembered Grant clearly. He was friendly and easy and calm. He cooked his dinner and shared a little of it. He hung his food up on the bear cables the way the park requires, and he sat talking with them by the fire ring until well after dark before turning in. Not one of them saw anything even slightly wrong. When the others woke the next morning, Grant was gone, but his gear was not. His pack was still there, propped against the shelter wall. His sleeping bag was still laid out inside. His boots were sitting neatly beside his sleeping pad where he had left them the night before. His food was still hanging untouched on the bear cables. Everything a person could possibly need to survive out there was exactly where he had left it, and the man himself had simply stepped off into the dark and not come back. The others assumed at first that he had gone ahead early until they saw the boots, and a cold, crawling understanding set in that a person does not leave on a hard trip without his boots. The last trace of him is an entry in the shelter register, written in his own hand that evening. It starts out perfectly ordinary, noting the date and the miles he had covered and how good the fire felt after a long day. And then the final line, apparently written as he was settling in for the night, just stops partway through a sentence about the sound of the creek down below, the writing simply breaking off, unfinished, as though he had set the pen down and never picked it back up. Investigators built the most likely version of events from the scene, and it is painfully simple. Sometime deep in the night, Grant had gotten up, almost certainly just to relieve himself, and stepped away from the shelter in the pitch black without his boots and without a headlamp, most likely meaning to go only a few yards and come right back, the way he had on countless nights before. But in country like that, under heavy tree cover with no moon, a few yards is all it takes. The Rangers believe he got turned around within sight of a shelter he could no longer see in the dark, drifted downhill the way disoriented people almost always do, and came out at the edge of the creek without ever realizing how far he had gone. There are a few details that make Grant's case land harder the longer you sit with it. The first is how experienced he was. This was a man who had spent years alone in country like this, who who understood cold and dark and water better than almost anyone, and none of it saved him, because the thing that killed him was not a lack of skill, it was the lack of a headlamp for a 30-second errand he had done 1,000 times. The second is the water. That spring, the creek below the shelter was running high and cold with snowmelt, loud enough that the backpackers had remarked on it, and in the pitch dark, barefoot on wet rock, a person already turned around only had to misjudge a single step at the bank. The third is the register page. The Rangers kept it, and his family later asked to see it, that ordinary entry simply breaking off in the middle of a sentence, with nothing in it to suggest he had any idea it would be the last thing he ever wrote. There was never any sign of foul play, no struggle, nothing taken, nothing to suggest anything but a good and careful man undone by the smallest possible mistake in the worst possible place to make it. The gear is the part that just horrifies me. Everything he needed was 10 feet away, and he never found his way back to any of it. And despite being one of the most careful people out there, he was undone in the dark. Grant's body was recovered more than 2 weeks later, over a mile downstream, by a man out fishing. The spring melt had the creek running fast and full, more than enough to carry him well beyond the stretch the first searchers had ever thought to check. The medical examiner ruled that he had drowned, most likely that same night after entering the cold, swollen creek somewhere in the dark. He had survived a decade of hard solo trips and was undone by a barefoot errand that should have lasted 30 seconds. The three strangers who shared that fire with him were the last people ever to speak to him, and it is only because they came forward that anyone knows how calm and ordinary his final evening truly was. It was October 29th, 2019. Vincent Adler was 47 years old and had spent the past 14 years as a ranger in Yosemite National Park. At home, he had a wife named Claire, a quiet and steady woman who had built a life around a man whose job had a way of following him home, and a teenage son named Daniel, who thought his father was the most capable person he had ever known and wanted nothing more than to grow up and do exactly what he did. Before we get into what happened to Vincent, you need to understand who he was first, because those two things are completely inseparable. Vincent came to ranger work late. Most of the people he worked alongside had wanted this since they were kids, grew up camping, studied environmental science, applied to the Park Service straight out of college. Vincent wasn't that. He came to it at 33, through a path his partner Simon Vickers described as something Vincent never really talked about in detail. What Simon knew was that by the time Vincent showed up at Yosemite, he had already lived enough of another life to know exactly what he was choosing. And when you choose something deliberately like that, after already knowing what the alternative looks like, you take it seriously in a different way. You're not there because it seemed like a good idea, you're there because you decided. Quiet and methodical, Vincent was the kind of person who listened more than he talked and noticed more than he said. Simon often described him as someone who could walk into any situation and immediately spot the one thing that didn't belong. It might be a detail in a report, a section of trail that looked slightly off, or a pattern everyone else had dismissed as coincidence. That was simply how his mind worked. Once something caught his attention, he could not let it go until it made sense. That instinct made him one of the most respected rangers in the park. Claire used to joke that nothing in their house stayed broken for long because Vincent could not walk past a problem without trying to fix it. Daniel grew up believing that was simply who his father was. He noticed things, and he never walked away from them. Simon had been Vincent's partner for 6 years by the time any of this happened. That was long enough to know his habits almost as well as his own. They worked well together because they balanced each other. Simon was measured where Vincent was relentless. He was practical where Vincent was driven by principle. He was also one of the few people who could talk Vincent out of charging ahead without making him feel like he was being managed. I think everyone hopes they'll have one coworker like that at some point. Meanwhile, some of us are just trying to find one who replies to emails. But Simon knew Vincent had a limit. There came a point where his own convictions took over completely. Once that happened, nobody, not even Simon, was going to change his mind. Simon had seen it happen 3 times before, and each time it became a little harder to pull Vincent back. It was not the first time Vincent had been told to let something go. A few years into his career, he repeatedly warned that a section of hiking trail was becoming unstable. His reports were dismissed. 3 months later, a hiker fell when that exact section gave way beneath her and had to be airlifted out with both legs broken. The incident was written off as an unfortunate accident, and Vincent's earlier warnings were never mentioned. The second time came after he and Simon found signs of unauthorized activity deep inside a protected wildlife zone. Their report was closed within days, with an explanation Vincent never believed. He kept looking for answers until his supervisor ordered him to stop. The third nearly cost him his job. Vincent questioned the official findings in a missing hiker case and pushed well beyond his assigned duties before receiving a formal warning. Normally, I'd be the first person to say, trust the process. In this case, yeah, I don't know. The process was kind of on probation at this point. So by the time this story really begins, Vincent had already made up his mind about one thing. Every time he ignored his instincts because someone told him to, something important was left unexplained. That belief would shape every decision he made from that point on. Late October, a Tuesday, Vincent and Simon were running a standard backcountry patrol, a route they had covered dozens of times before. Clear weather, no active permits in the zone, no reported incidents, the kind of day that starts and ends without anything worth writing down. At a certain point in the patrol, Vincent's pace changed. Simon noticed immediately because one of the things 6 years of partnership teaches you is what your partner looks like when something has caught their attention, and this was that. He watched Vincent's focus shift toward the tree line to their left, watched him slow to a stop, and then watched him move off the established trail without saying a word. What Vincent had caught was a trail, narrow, unmarked, running perpendicular to their patrol route and disappearing into the tree line, heading deeper into an area that had long been closed to the public. Not a game trail, not erosion, not anything a casual observer would have clocked as significant. Worn ground, deliberate, consistent. The kind of trail that gets that way from repeated use over a long period of time, where the earth has been pressed down enough times that it holds the shape of it long after the last person passed through. Someone had been walking this path regularly enough that the ground remembered it. Vincent stood at the entrance of it for a moment, said nothing, and then turned back to the patrol route like nothing had happened. He finished the rest of that patrol in near silence. Simon tried conversation twice and got short responses both times. Quiet Vincent was always the version worth paying attention to. Frustrated Vincent vented and moved on. Quiet Vincent was somewhere else entirely, turning something over in his head that the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. That night, Vincent spread maps across the kitchen table and went through every official document he could access for that zone. Permit records, geological surveys, historical patrol logs going back decades. The trail did not exist on any of the documents he pulled, not a single record, not a single reference. A trail that was clearly real, clearly established, clearly used, and completely absent from every official document that should have captured it. He called Simon late that night and told him what he had found, or more precisely, what he hadn't found. Simon listened to all of it and told him to file a report and leave it alone. I can't even blame Simon for that one. That's solid advice right there. The only problem was he was giving it to Vincent. He went back 3 days later, alone and off duty. The trail entrance was exactly where he had noted it, narrow and deliberate, cutting away from the open terrain and into the tree cover, heading deeper into the restricted zone. He followed it. The further in he went, the more established it felt beneath his feet. The ground packed hard in a way that takes years of consistent use to produce. Vegetation on either side, pushed back not by weather or animals, but by repeated passage in the same direction over a long period of time. At that elevation in late October, the soil was soft and covered in patches of early frost, the kind that forms overnight when the temperature drops below freezing and sits on the surface until the afternoon sun reaches it. Footprints pressed into frost-covered mud hold their shape clearly and read as recent because disturbed frost doesn't refreeze the same way. The prints Vincent found were recent. Fresh enough that the frost around the edges of each one was still intact, they went in. None came out in the section he covered. He followed the trail for about a mile before turning back, not because he wanted to stop, but because he hadn't told anyone his exact location and knew he needed to be careful about that. The drive home that evening was the kind where you cover the distance without really registering it, your mind somewhere else entirely. He had spent 14 years in that park. He knew every permitted trail, every documented route, every officially acknowledged path through that backcountry. What he had just walked was none of those things. And the footprints going in, with none coming out, were not a detail he could file away and forget. He sat with it through dinner, through the evening, through the kind of restless half-sleep that comes when your brain refuses to stop working. He told Simon everything the next morning and showed him the photographs. Simon looked at them for a long time without saying anything because there wasn't much to say. The trail was real. The prints were real. The complete absence of any official record of either was real. Simon told him to document everything and give the park a chance to do its job. Now, knowing Vincent, you'd probably think he ignored Simon completely. Honestly, so did I, but he actually filed the report. It was acknowledged within 48 hours. Nothing happened after that. A week passed with no response, no follow-up, no investigation launched. Vincent followed up internally and was told the report was under review. He checked again the following week, still under review. Those 2 weeks were the kind of waiting that gets under your skin. Simon watched Vincent check his messages more than usual, watched him pull up the report status, and put his phone down and pick it up again an hour later. He wasn't panicking. He was just watching a clock that wasn't moving and trying to decide how long he was willing to wait before he stopped waiting. The answer, as Simon already knew, was not much longer. Think about what that silence actually meant. 48 hours to acknowledge a report about an unmapped trail with fresh footprints in a restricted section of the park, and then 2 weeks of nothing. No questions, no follow-up ranger sent out to verify, no request for his photographs, just received and then silence. You don't even need answers right away. Just give the guy something, anything. Vincent told Simon he was going back, and this time he wanted Simon with him. Simon agreed. Whatever was out there, going together felt like the smarter move. At least this time, Simon could keep an eye on him. They headed out on a shared day off, casual, not making it obvious, moving toward the area where Vincent had found the trail entrance. They never got there. Somewhere in the restricted zone, before they reached it, they crossed paths with a senior park official. Someone with enough authority that running into them in that zone on what should have been a quiet personal day required an explanation. They made something up on the spot, kept it light. 2 rangers out for a walk on their day off, nothing unusual about that. The official was pleasant enough. He told them he was out checking on some erosion markers in the zone, the kind of explanation that sounds reasonable on the surface and would satisfy most people. He asked a few easy questions, made some small talk, and moved on. The whole interaction lasted maybe 5 minutes and looked completely unremarkable from the outside. The walk back was quieter than usual. Simon tried making conversation a couple of times, but Vincent never had much to say. That evening, Vincent called him again and brought up the park official almost immediately. Erosion marker checks in that part of the park were supposed to be logged and scheduled through the department. Before they had gone out, Vincent had pulled the scheduling records for that zone through his regular system access. There was nothing scheduled that day that would have put a senior park official anywhere near that part of the park. Simon told him he was probably reading too much into it. Officials moved around the park for all kinds of reasons, and not everything ended up in the system. Not every odd detail had to mean something. Simon tried to talk him out of it, but Vincent told him he was going back alone from that point on. He said he would call after every visit so Simon would know he was okay. Whatever this was, he didn't want Simon anywhere near it. Simon pushed back. He told Vincent that wasn't how partners worked. If something happened out there and nobody knew exactly where he was, nobody would even know where to start looking. Vincent told him he knew, but he wasn't backing off. I actually like that Simon kept pushing back because a lot of stories make the best friend immediately go along with everything. Real friends are usually the ones who tell you when they think you're making a mistake. Simon has said since that was the moment the whole thing shifted for him. Not just an unexplained trail anymore. Something Vincent believed was being actively protected, and something he believed Simon was better off not being too close to. What followed was an arrangement Simon never got comfortable with, but had no way to change. Vincent went in alone and called Simon after each visit. Simon listened, asked questions, pushed back where he could, and spent the time between calls sitting with the particular discomfort of knowing someone you trust is walking into something you can't follow them into. He has described it as watching someone walk toward the edge of something in slow motion and not being able to close the distance no matter how fast you move. Simon wasn't trying to solve the mystery anymore. He was just trying to keep his partner alive. Vincent went back twice more over the following 2 weeks, alone each time. The footprints in the frost-covered mud were there on both visits, fresh ones each time, going in, none coming out. On his second visit, he followed the trail further than he had gone before, deep enough into the restricted zone that the terrain around him had changed significantly from the trail entrance, the tree cover thickening, the light dropping, the packed ground beneath him holding the same deliberate consistency it had held from the very beginning. He came back from that visit and told Simon the trail didn't end where he had stopped. It kept going. He still hadn't reached the end of it. And the way he said it wasn't like someone frustrated by an unanswered question. It was like someone who had already decided what they were going to do next and was just letting you know. Simon sat him down after that, not as a colleague checking in, but as someone who had watched this exact pattern play out 3 times before and could see with complete clarity where it was heading. He laid it out plainly. The report had been filed and ignored. The area was closed to public access for reasons nobody had explained to Vincent. He was going in alone with nobody knowing his exact location. Whatever was using that trail knew that terrain far better than Vincent did. The institution that was supposed to respond to his report had already chosen not to. and a senior park official had appeared in that restricted zone on the exact day they were heading toward the trail entrance with an explanation that didn't check out against the department logs. Taken individually, any one of those things could be explained away. Together, they pointed to something that was bigger than what Vincent could handle by going in alone. He told Vincent that whatever was at the end of that trail had stayed unfound for a reason, and that the reason was not an accident. Somewhere along the way, the argument changed. It stopped being about whether Vincent was right and started being about whether this was worth the risk. Vincent listened to everything. He didn't argue or push back or try to poke holes in any of it. He just listened, and when Simon finished, he thanked him. Genuinely, the way you thank someone when you know they're right and you've already made your decision anyway, which is somehow worse than if he had argued, because an argument means the door is still open. That kind of quiet thank you means it isn't. 2 days later, he told Simon he was going back in one final time to follow the trail to its end, and that if he found nothing conclusive, he would drop it completely. Simon told him not to go. Vincent said he understood, and the next morning he was gone before the sun came up. Those 2 days between Simon's warning and Vincent leaving are something Simon has turned over more times than he can count. He has said that Vincent seemed different during those 2 days, but he could never quite explain why. He wasn't acting nervous, and he wasn't distracted either. If anything, he seemed unusually calm, like someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to carry it out. He spent one of those evenings at home with Claire and Daniel, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what Daniel remembered afterward. Years later, he would say his dad seemed especially present that night. He wasn't thinking about work the way he sometimes did when something was bothering him. He was just there. And isn't it strange how it's always the little moments like that that people remember afterward? The evening didn't seem important at the time. It only became important because everyone knew what came next. Vincent had submitted a personal day request the evening before, approved automatically through the scheduling system the way they always were. He left the house Tuesday morning while it was still dark, which according to Claire was not unusual for him on backcountry days. She was used to the routine. Cell service out there was unreliable, and she had learned over 14 years not to expect regular check-ins. What she did expect was him home by dinner. That was the unspoken rule between them, the one constant across 14 years of personal day hikes. When dinner came and went and the house stayed quiet, she called Simon. By that point, Simon had already been sitting with a bad feeling since mid-afternoon when Vincent hadn't responded to a message he had sent that morning, because Vincent always responded eventually, even from areas with limited signal. The silence had been wrong for hours. By the time Claire's call came, it wasn't a surprise. It was the confirmation of something Simon had already been dreading since he picked up his phone that morning and saw nothing back. Search and rescue was launched the following day. Simon told them everything he knew: the restricted zone, the general area Vincent had described, the photographs Vincent had shown him from multiple visits. Without Vincent's exact route, though, Simon could only point rescuers toward a broad section of backcountry that covered far more ground than it sounds. He had never walked the trail himself. Everything he knew about it came from Vincent. Simon could confirm everything leading up to that final trip. What he couldn't confirm was what happened after Vincent entered the area alone that morning. The search team went out. They covered the accessible terrain in the area Simon had described. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a disturbance in the ground, not a trail entrance. They came back with nothing on the first day and went back out and came back with nothing again. The search ran for 5 days. 5 days for a missing ranger with 14 years of experience in that specific park. A ranger whose partner had given the search team everything he knew about the trail and the area Vincent had been investigating. Helicopters covering the zone from above, dogs working the ground, teams on foot moving through every section of accessible terrain in the area. After 5 days, the intensive search was scaled back as crews exhausted the highest probability areas. The case itself remained open, but the large-scale operation came to an end. Public updates became infrequent after that, and Simon never received any significant new information beyond being told the investigation was still open. If that number doesn't strike you as remarkably short for a missing ranger whose partner had provided photographs, descriptions, and a specific area to search, I don't know what to tell you. And here's the part that doesn't add up, no matter how many times you look at it. Simon could verify everything leading up to that morning. Claire could verify Vincent left before sunrise. Vincent's photographs documented the trail he said he had found, and the search records documented the effort to find him. But once Vincent entered that area alone, that's where the trail goes cold. Nobody knows how far he made it or what happened after that. This is the part where I keep stopping and thinking, wait, how? A veteran ranger found that trail multiple times. Then, a search involving helicopters, dogs, and teams on foot went into the same area and came back without finding a single trace of it.
My dog can somehow sniff out a treat I dropped under the couch 2 days ago. You're telling me trained search dogs couldn't find a well-used trail that Vincent had already walked multiple times?
I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying I'd really like to know how that happened. Simon watched the whole thing play out and said nothing publicly about what he was thinking. But he had spent 6 years working alongside a man who believed that facts laid out plainly had a way of telling you everything you needed to know. The report Vincent filed had been acknowledged and buried. The unauthorized presence they had found years earlier had been closed without a real investigation. The park official had appeared in that restricted zone on the exact day they were heading toward the trail entrance with an explanation that didn't hold up. And now an extensive search for a missing ranger had come back empty-handed despite the photographs, descriptions, and general search area Simon had provided. Simon has never made a public accusation. He has never pointed a finger at anyone by name. He still works at that park, still runs his patrols, still does his job. But he has said that the hardest part of all of it is not having anywhere to put what he knows. That you can carry facts around for a long time without being able to do anything with them, and that the weight of them doesn't get lighter, it just gets more familiar. Vincent Adler has never been found. The internal report he filed is still listed as under review. Simon checked it himself through the same system Vincent used. Nobody had touched it. Claire still lives in the same house. She has kept everything. His patrol logs, his personal photographs, the documentation he compiled across every case he ever pushed on, all of it organized the way Vincent organized everything. Methodical, thorough, nothing out of place. She has said that keeping it organized feels like the only thing she can do for him now. That if someone ever comes looking for answers, if someone ever decides to take seriously what Vincent spent years trying to tell people, it will all be there waiting. Every report, every photograph, every detail of everything he noticed that the institution told him to stop noticing. Daniel grew up around those records. He watched Claire maintain them after Vincent disappeared, watched her keep everything exactly the way his father had left it, and understood without being told that this was how you honored someone who believed the truth was worth preserving. He grew up wanting to be exactly like his father, wanting to be the kind of person who noticed things and didn't walk away from them, who believed the truth was worth the cost of finding it. He still wants that. He has just learned that wanting it comes with a weight his father never warned him about, maybe because Vincent never felt it as a weight. Maybe because for Vincent it was just the only way he knew how to be. You know what gets me about this whole story? A kid watched his father leave before sunrise on a Tuesday morning and never come home. Not knowing that the version of his father he watched walk out that door, the one who noticed things and couldn't leave them alone and believed the truth was always worth the cost, was walking toward the exact thing that quality was always going to lead him to eventually. Vincent Adler spent 14 years being right about everything he refused to let go of. He taught his son that being that kind of person mattered. He just never got to tell him how the story ended. And Daniel, who grew up wanting nothing more than to be exactly like his father, is now old enough to understand that being exactly like his father might mean spending the rest of his life looking for an answer that the people who have it are never going to give him, just like Vincent did, right up until the very end. That is going to do it for today. If you think Vincent deserved better, share this with someone. Subscribe if you're new here, because we do this every single week, and it only gets heavier from here. If you've got a theory or just a thought about this case, leave it in the comments. I'll be reading through them before the next one. See you then. It was the 6th of July, 2019, a hot, green, ordinary summer Saturday. The kind of day the coves fill up with reunions and coolers and children running loose in the grass. One large family had gathered at a quiet picnic area tucked deep in a cove on the North Carolina side of the park. These deep coves feel about as tame as a park gets. Mowed grass and picnic tables and a slow creek, which is exactly why no one there was thinking about how fast the ground turns wild just past the last row of cars. Among them was Harlan Frady, 71, a retired school teacher from nearby Waynesville, a grandfather many times over, still active and independent and sharp on his good days, but in the very early stages of the memory trouble his family had only just begun to admit they were seeing. He had taught high school history for more than 30 years and could still recite whole speeches from memory, and that lingering sharpness is part of why his family had been slow to accept that he could no longer be left entirely on his own in an unfamiliar place. In the happy noise of a reunion, with dozens of people and children everywhere, everyone always assumed that someone else had an eye on him. He stepped away from from the tables, and every single person there later assumed he had gone toward the restrooms or back to the cars. In the space of a few unwatched minutes, Harlan was simply gone. At first, no one was alarmed at all. They checked the cars and the restrooms and the short loop down by the creek, calling his name, half annoyed and half amused. But the calling got no answer, and the amusement drained away, and within the hour, the family understood this was something far worse than a man wandering off for a quiet moment to himself. The National Park Service response was enormous, with dogs, county rescue squads, and volunteer teams pouring in under a formal incident command, the helicopter good only for aerial observation, where the summer canopy broke, everyone working straight through the night, because the searchers knew something the family did not yet fully grasp about how these particular cases tend to go. There is a grim, well-documented pattern to how people with dementia go missing in wild country, and the rangers who run these searches know it cold. A person in that state often will not answer to their own name, will move right past searchers calling out to them, and will keep moving with a strange, fixed determination, many of them holding a straight, determined line into steep terrain or up a drainage rather than following the easy ground, until something physical finally stops them. They are found again and again, much farther out and in far rougher terrain than anyone believes a frail person could possibly reach. And that is exactly what Harlan did. He was found on the fourth day, deceased, more than 3 miles from that picnic table, high up a brutally steep and trackless drainage that had worn out the young searchers who finally reached him. The medical examiner ruled the death exposure, with hypothermia a contributing factor. It sounds strange for July, but he had gained thousands of feet into the far cooler air of the high country. An exhausted 71-year-old man in thin summer clothes, damp with sweat, and once the mountain night came down and the temperature fell, a body in that state loses heat far faster than most people expect. The searchers who reached him understood at once what they were looking at, because they had been trained to expect exactly this. When a person with dementia goes missing, the search is run almost backward from a normal one. Instead of starting with the easy, obvious places a lost person would logically go, the teams push hard and early into the steep, tangled, uphill ground a clear-headed adult would sensibly avoid, because in case after case, that is precisely where these victims are found. They often will not answer when their own name is called, sometimes hiding from the very searchers trying to save them. Harlan had climbed a drainage so steep and so choked that the 2 rangers who found him were breathing hard by the time they got there, and he had done it in ordinary shoes, in the dark at 71 years old, following the same fixed, determined line into steep ground that searchers are trained to expect in cases like his. His family has said the hardest part is not knowing what he was thinking, whether he believed he was heading home, or looking for one of them, or simply following a path only he could see. I keep thinking about how quiet and cold it must have been up there, and how far he managed to get before anyone could reach him. I want to put it out there, his family did nothing wrong. He was there 1 minute and gone the next. In the time since, his family has become quiet advocates for the simple tracking bracelets and clip-on devices made for people who are prone to wandering. The unglamorous little precaution that, in a case like Harlan's, is very often the entire difference between a bad scare and a funeral. It was the 9th of August, 2014, a warm and ordinary afternoon in the middle of a busy summer season, when a young woman set off on foot from a quiet trailhead in the park's canyon country with a small day pack and a plan to be back at her bunk by supper, into a forest so vast and so unmarked that a person a mile off the path can be as hidden as if they had stepped off the edge of the world, and no one realized she was overdue for several hours. Bethany Barrett was 21 years old, a nursing student from Brainerd, Minnesota, and she was not the kind of person you picture when you imagine someone getting into trouble in the backcountry. She had grown up on lakes and in canoes, she was fit and capable and sensible in most of the ways that count, and she had saved for 2 years to spend a single summer working a seasonal job at one of the park lodges, waiting tables so that she could spend her days off seeing the West she had only ever read about. The people who worked alongside her that summer described her the same way her family did, warm and funny and a little stubborn, the sort of young woman who made a plan and kept it. She had come out to Yellowstone the way a lot of young people from the Midwest do, on a seasonal work contract that traded long shifts for a summer inside one of the most beautiful places in the country, and she was having the time of her life. She sent her family photographs almost every day, not for any audience but just for them, of bison stopped in the road and steam rising off the geyser basins and the long gold light over the meadows in the evening. She had a plan for after, a last year of nursing school and a job back home near her family, and this summer was the adventure she had promised herself before her real life began. That is the version of her that everyone who knew her keeps returning to. A careful young woman on the one big adventure of her life, not a thrill seeker and not a fool.
I want you to be open-minded here, because she was no careless tourist who wandered off a boardwalk in sandals. She was capable, experienced, and had done harder activities than this one before.
Here is the thing that quietly set the trap. Bethany had been in the park for most of the summer by that August, and she had spent nearly every day off out on its trails, always coming back tired and happy and fine. She had learned the roads and which trailhead stayed quiet, and after 10 or 12 of these little trips with nothing going wrong, the park had stopped feeling like a wilderness tour and started feeling like a backyard. That is the oldest and most human mistake there is. A dozen easy walks that all end well do not teach a person that the warnings are wrong, but they slowly teach her that the warnings are meant for other people, the unprepared ones, the ones who do not know what she had learned. Every quiet, uneventful trip made the next one feel a little safer, and made the voice that says, "Take someone with you," a little easier to ignore. You could see it in the small ways her habits had loosened over the weeks. Early in the summer, she had gone out with groups, the way the park strongly recommends, but the other seasonal workers had their own shifts and their own days off, and it is hard to gather a crowd every single time you want to see something. So more and more she had started going by herself, just for a few hours, just on the easy trails, and every single time it had been fine. One of her co-workers said afterward that the two of them had talked about walking to that very lake together on a shared day off later in the month, and that Bethany, impatient the way she could sometimes be, had not wanted to wait for it. To understand what she walked into, you have to throw out whatever picture the word park puts in your head. Yellowstone is not a tidy place with a fence around it. It is more than 2 million acres, larger than some entire states, and a great deal of it is a rolling ocean of lodgepole pine that looks exactly the same in every direction you turn, mile after mile of straight gray trunks with almost nothing to fix your eye on. Whole stretches of it burned in the Great Fires decades ago and grew back as dense young forest and tangled deadfall, thick enough in places to swallow sound and sight within a few steps. There is no cell signal across most of the backcountry. The rivers run cold and fast and deceptively strong, and the ground itself is not always solid because in the thermal areas, a bright crust can lie over water hot enough to kill. It is high country too, most of it up around 7,000 or 8,000 feet, which means the sun is fierce by day and the temperature can fall hard and fast once it goes down, even in August. Some of the danger out there is the obvious kind that Yellowstone is famous for, the scalding thermal ground just off the boardwalks and the swift, snowmelt cold rivers that run far stronger than they look, and much of it is warned about on sign after sign. But the danger that would matter for Bethany was quieter and far less dramatic than any of that. It was the forest itself, which still carries the marks of the enormous fires that swept the park decades ago. Whole hillsides grown back into dense, even ranks of young pine tangled with the silver deadfall of the trees that burned. Ground so thick and so featureless that searchers describe pushing through it for an hour and feeling as though they have not moved at all.
I've covered a lot of wild country, and a few places unsettle me the way that this one does. There are many dangers that you can't avoid, and the sheer size of it can be absolutely terrifying.
And then there is the wildlife, which is the reason the most repeated recommendation in that whole park is the one Bethany ignored before she ever took a step. This is grizzly country, and the Park Service says the same thing on sign after sign at every trailhead, that you should not hike alone out here, that you should travel in a group of 3 or more, that you should carry bear spray and keep it where you can reach it, and make noise as you go. On top of that come the rules that apply to any big backcountry. Tell someone exactly where you are going and when you will be back. Carry far more water and warm layers than a short walk seems to need, and stay on the marked trail, because off of it the country stops making sense in a hurry. Bethany had heard every one of these warnings, more than once, from the trailhead signs and from the wildlife safety orientation given to seasonal employees. She knew them cold. She simply went alone anyway, the way she had a dozen times before. And it was not only the signs doing the warning. The rules were part of the job for her, printed on the trailhead board she walked past every week, and covered in the employee orientation and bear safety training the lodge ran for its seasonal staff. She could have recited them in her sleep. One coworker remembered gently ribbing her that morning about heading out alone again, telling her, only half joking, to at least send a text the moment she was back, and Bethany laughing it off the way she always did, promising she would be careful and that it was just a quick one. It was the last easy exchange the two of them would ever have.
I kept agonizing over the fact that she had been warned again and again, because in reality, knowing a rule and following it are two entirely different things. The walk she chose for that day off was not one of the crowded, famous ones. It was a quieter spur trail in the park's canyon country, a few miles east of the main road, that ran back through the forest to a small backcountry lake she had wanted to see all summer, a few miles in and a few miles out, the kind of easy half-day trip she had done versions of again and again. That morning, she told her roommate, a fellow seasonal worker, that she was going to finally go see the lake and would be back before dark, the same thing she always said. She texted her mother a photo of the trailhead sign and a short message that she was heading out and would call that evening. She took one of the staff bikes down to the trailhead and locked it near the trailhead sign, which is where it would later be found, a small ordinary detail that became the first fixed point in everything that came after. What she carried is its own quiet part of the story. From what was later recovered, she had gone out the way she had gone out a dozen times before, with a small day pack, a bottle or two of water, her phone, and a single light layer, plenty for the easy half-day walk she had planned, and nowhere near enough for a night out in that country if anything went wrong. No bear spray was found with her gear, no map beyond the one in her head, and no way to call for help once she was deeper into the backcountry, where much of the park has no reliable cellular service. None of that would have mattered in the slightest on the day she expected to have. All of it would matter enormously on the day she ended up with. For the first part of the day, everything about it was completely normal, and there are people who can tell us so. A short way up the trail, Bethany passed a couple who were on their way back out, an older pair who had walked into the lake that morning and were heading home, and they remembered her clearly afterward, a cheerful young woman hiking alone with a small pack, who stopped to ask how the lake was and how much farther it lay ahead. They told her it was worth the walk, and they noticed, the way experienced hikers do, that she was on her own and carrying very little, but she seemed relaxed and sure of herself. And it was the middle of a bright summer afternoon, and so they said their goodbyes and kept walking. When they heard, days later, that a young woman had gone missing on that trail, they came forward on their own, and the time and the place where they had crossed paths with her became one of the only solid points the search would ever have. They were the last people who are known to have seen Bethany Barrett. An older couple stopped, wished her well, and walked on, because why would they have done otherwise? I found out through interviews later on that they regretted that ordinary goodbye ever since, and I just find that so depressing, because it's not their fault in the slightest. By the accounts of the people who knew her habits best, her roommate and her family, Bethany was reliable to a fault about checking in, and when she was not back by dark and did not call her mother that evening, the worry started fast. Her roommate first assumed she had simply lost track of time or stayed out for the sunset, but as the night wore on with no word and no answer to a single text or call, that explanation stopped being enough. There was no signal to reach her on, no way to know if she was hurt or lost or just late, and by the time her roommate reported her overdue to a housing supervisor and park dispatch was notified, Bethany had already been somewhere out in that forest, alone, for the better part of a night. Even then, the first hours moved slowly, for reasons that are painfully ordinary. Seasonal workers came and went on their days off, sometimes staying out late or catching a ride to a town beyond the park, and a young woman not back by dark on a summer evening did not, on its own, mean disaster. Rangers also have to narrow the likely search area before they can commit real resources to it. It was only as the whole night wore through with no word at all that the situation hardened from worry into emergency, and by the time real resources could move at first light, a great deal of the time that matters most in a search like this was already gone. When the effort did begin in earnest, it began the way these things always do, with the quiet groundwork that rarely makes the news. Rangers checking her bunk and the lodge, speaking with the co-workers who had seen her that morning, and confirming exactly which trail she had set out to walk, all before a single grid line was ever pushed into the forest. The search that followed was one of the larger searches conducted in that district that summer. The National Park Service ran it under a formal incident command, and they pulled in everything: ranger teams and trained search crews, scent dogs, helicopter crews scanning the meadows, burn scars, and river corridors where visibility from the air was possible, and search and rescue volunteers from the surrounding counties in Wyoming and Montana. The bike at the trailhead and the couple's account gave them a place to start, a trail to work outward from, and for days they pushed grid lines through the forest and along the lake and down the drainages that led away from it, calling her name and blowing whistles into country that gave almost nothing back. Everything about that place worked against them. The scent dogs were unable to maintain a reliable trail, worn away by shifting winds, the time that had already passed, difficult terrain, and the searchers who had already passed through the same ground. The helicopter could pick out the meadows and the burn scars and the open water, but not the forest floor beneath the canopy, where a person could lie a few feet from a searcher and never be seen from above. The ground teams could only cover so much country in a day in terrain that slowed them to a crawl, and every drainage they cleared seemed to open onto two more. And underneath all of it ran the simple, punishing arithmetic of the search, that the longer she had been moving before she stopped, the larger the circle that could hold her became, until the area they truly needed to cover was bigger than any number of people could ever comb. Search managers kept recalculating the highest probability areas as the days passed, with no new information, until they had worked through nearly every place the statistics said she was most likely to be. I still can't wrap my head around how a search that big, starting from a known trail, could push for days and days and turn up absolutely nothing. It tells you something about the size and danger of that place. The days became a week, and the week became more, and slowly, the way these things always do, the search wound down. There was only so long even the largest effort can keep dozens of people combing wild country with no new sign to follow, and eventually the active search became a cold case, a name in a file, and a family flying home without an answer. Her mother, her roommate, and the friends she had made that summer were left in the worst place a person can be left. Not with grief exactly, because grief needs something to close around, but with a question that simply would not end. For years, there was nothing. No sighting, no trace, no call. Bethany Barrett had walked up a quiet trail on a bright afternoon and had, as far as anyone could prove, simply dissolved into the forest. Her family did not let it go, the way families in these cases so rarely can. They kept her name in front of the park and the public, they came back for the anniversaries, they pushed for the case to stay open long after the active search had ended. They lived in the terrible open space of a person who is gone but not confirmed gone, where a phone ringing at an odd hour brings a jolt of hope and dread in the same instant, and where there is nothing to bury and no place to stand and finally say goodbye. Years of that is a weight most of us will thankfully never have to imagine carrying. In those years, the park kept her missing person notice posted, and every so often, a tip would drift in. A hiker who thought they remembered a face, a scrap of gear found in some far corner that turned out to belong to a stranger. Each one lifted the family for a day and then set them back down in exactly the place they had been standing. The hard truth, though no one could prove it yet, was that she had never been anywhere the tips were looking, and that the forest had closed over the answer so completely that only time and chance would ever pry it back open. And that is where the story sat, unanswered, for 8 years. The seasons turned over that forest 8 times, the summer crowds came and went, and the file stayed open and cold. Then, one afternoon, late in the summer, almost exactly 8 years after she had chained a bike at that trailhead, a backcountry trail crew doing maintenance work well off the established routes came upon what nobody had ever expected to find. Far from the lake, well outside the grid the original search had ever reached, down in a remote drainage that the low ground funnels you toward if you keep walking the wrong way, they found the scattered remains of a person, along with a faded day pack, a single hiking boot, a water bottle, and a phone long since dead. Dental records confirmed what the location and the pack had already made almost certain. After 8 years, Bethany Barrett may have finally been found. She was found far outside anything the original search had ever been able to reach, down in low, remote ground of the kind the shape of the land funnels a walker into if they keep moving away from the high trail, consistent with the pattern seen in many wilderness missing person cases, and exactly the sort of place that had been too far out for anyone to search at the time. The faded pack, the single boot, the bottle, and the dead phone were still there with her, worn by 8 years of weather, and it was the phone and the dental records together that turned a heartbreaking discovery into a certain answer for a family that had waited the better part of a decade to receive one. 8 years. I want you to let that sink in. 8 summers of that forest going green and gold and white again, while a family waited, and she was out there the whole time, well past where anyone had been able to look. To understand why all of that effort came up empty, you have to understand what it is to be turned around in a forest like that one. Investigators and the searchers who work that country will tell you the pattern because they have seen it again and again. A person steps a little way off the trail for a photograph or a quiet spot or what looks like an easy shortcut through the trees. And in forest, that uniform, with no landmark to steer by and the trail already out of sight behind them, it takes shockingly little to lose the thread of where they came from. Once that happens, many people do not stay put, even though remaining in one place often gives searchers their best chance of finding them. Instead, they walk, trying to correct, and lost people tend to drift downhill and follow the low ground and the water, moving steadily away from the trail and deeper into the country rather than back toward it, often covering far more distance than anyone searching for them would ever think to look. It is a pattern with a grim grim consistency to it, and it is exactly why searchers in country like that do not only look where a sensible, clear-headed person would go. A lost and frightened person is not thinking the way someone reading a map in a warm room thinks. They follow the ground that is easiest to walk, they push toward the gaps in the trees that seem to promise a way through, and they very often end up far down some drainage that leads nowhere, farther from help with every hour. As far as the evidence would ever be able to show, that is quietly and steadily what happened. The distance between Bethany and the trail growing, while the search massed around ground, she was no longer anywhere near. What happened to her was pieced together carefully afterward, and it is important to say plainly that no one witnessed any of it, so none of what follows is a claim about what she felt or thought out there, only what the evidence could support. Despite years of corrosion, a digital forensics lab was able to recover a small number of images and their timestamps from the phone's flash memory, and those, laid against the spot where she was found and the account of the couple who had passed her, helped investigators develop a likely explanation for what happened. The photographs from that afternoon show an ordinary happy walk, the trail, the trees, the light through the pines, and then a few final frames that no longer showed any established trail, only unbroken forest, of a kind investigators found consistent with the off-trail forest in the same drainage where she was found, though not an exact match to any one spot. Based on where she was ultimately found, so far down the wrong drainage, and so far from the trail, investigators believed she had become disoriented after leaving the path and had done what lost people so often do, walking on and following the low ground in a direction she likely believed was leading her out when it was leading her steadily deeper in. The sequence saved on the phone is its own quiet record. The early images are bright and unremarkable. The trail, the trees, a patch of open sky, the ordinary photographs of a good afternoon out. Then a handful of later frames step away from any trail at all into unbroken forest with no path anywhere in sight, and after those, the record simply thins and stops. Investigators were careful never to read more into the pictures than they could truly carry, but the contents of the images and their timestamps, set against where she was finally found, all pointed the same way, off the trail and down into country that offered no easy way back. No one can say what was going through her mind, and this channel will not pretend to. What the evidence points to is not panic or foolishness, only a wrong, unfortunate turn of events, and my condolence goes out to her family. The county coroner, with assistance from a forensic pathologist, found that the circumstances were most consistent with environmental exposure after she became lost, though after 8 years outside the exact final mechanism, whether cold, injury, dehydration, or some combination, could not be determined. From her supplies, the weather, and the ground she was found on, investigators concluded she had most likely died within the first few days after losing the trail. This is the quiet, undramatic truth the whole story had been building toward. High in that country, the nights fall cold even at the height of summer, and a person caught out without shelter or enough warm clothing, exhausted and off trail and unable to find the way back, loses heat faster than most people ever imagine. The location suggested she had eventually stopped traveling, unable to go any farther. She had walked out on a warm August afternoon, expecting to be back by supper, and in a place she never meant to still be, she never found her way out again, most likely within days of losing the trail and long before the search had any real chance of reaching that far. She set out on a bright afternoon for a short walk, and it crushes my soul that the best anyone can say, even now, is that the country and its cold nights were most likely more than she could survive. And that, in the end, is how all of this is known, because none of it is guesswork dressed up as fact. It comes from the images and timestamps recovered off her own phone, from the exact location and condition of her remains and her gear, from the account of the older couple who spoke with her on the trail and came forward on their own, from the roommate and the family who knew her plans and her habits and raised the alarm, from the records of the original Park Service search, and from the county coroner and the forensic pathologist who examined what was finally found. Where those sources run out, the honest account runs out too. And no one who has told this story has claimed to know the parts that were never recorded and never came back out of the forest with her. For her mother, the discovery after 8 years was the bitterest kind of mercy. An answer that closed a wound only by confirming the worst, but an answer all the same, after nearly a decade of the not knowing that is its own separate cruelty. In the time since, her family and the friends she made that summer have tried to turn the loss into a warning that might spare someone else, and they keep returning to the least glamorous
glamorous rules there are, the ones that never make a good story. Tell one trusted person your exact route and the hour you truly expect to be back. Do not walk into big country alone, especially where the signs recommend hiking in groups. Carry more warmth and more water than a short, easy walk could ever seem to need. And never, ever step off the trail in a place like that for something that looks like a shortcut or a better view. The hardest lesson here is the simplest one. Out there's no such thing as a little walk. Cherish every moment you have on this earth, and be sure to always keep an open mind out to warnings, no matter who or where they come from. It was the 12th of January, 2013, and a gray, still cold, sat over the high country, with a forecast that called for fog thickening into snow by afternoon. Up there in winter, the light goes flat and the trails empty out, and cell service disappears across most of that backcountry, so anyone past the trailhead is truly on their own, with no way to call out and no easy way for the outside world to fix their location. Nora Silvers, 38, from Burnsville, just over the North Carolina line, had spent years on these trails alone and knew the park as well as almost anyone. And that morning, she set out on a short solo outing anyway, despite the forecast. She had traveled this route before, in good weather. Friends would later describe her as meticulous, the type who left detailed plans and always checked in, and the one fact that she went out that day against a worsening forecast is the single choice none of them have ever been able to make sense of because it was so completely unlike her. When she did not come home and did not answer her phone, worried friends alerted the park, and her car was found right where she had left it at the trailhead, locked and already dusted with fresh snow. That single detail told the searchers everything and nothing at once. She had gone in, she had never come back out. The search that followed was a brutal, methodical race against the weather. Snow filled her tracks almost as fast as teams could find them, the fog grounded the helicopter for long stretches, and the cold and the wet worked against the dogs. But the same careful planning her friends had described gave the searchers something real to work with, a clear intended route to build the whole operation around, and under an incident command that pulled in county rescue squads and volunteer teams, dozens of people pushed through the deepening snow along that route and into the most likely drainages branching from it. She was more than a mile from the trail she had set out on, tucked into the lee of a boulder with her back to the wind, the collar of her jacket turned up, and her pack pulled in around her. The scene suggested she had stopped and tried to shelter rather than keep moving blindly, and that she had run out of time before the weather broke. And recovered with her were the small, ordinary things that let investigators reconstruct the rough shape of her final hours. This is the one that unsettles me the most, because there was no dramatic mistake to even point at. A familiar trail, bank of fog off the ridge, and hours later, an experienced woman was fighting for her life a mile from her car. Her phone, recovered with her, told much of the story on its own. The last photos on it are time-stamped to that first afternoon, a handful of gray frames of the trail dissolving into a wall of white as the snow swallowed the world, and after that, nothing but a short string of failed, unsent messages. The phone reaching over and over for a signal that never came while its battery drained away in the cold. The medical examiner's conclusion was death from exposure. The most likely story the evidence could tell was that on that first afternoon, the fog and the snow had rolled in exactly as forecast, that Nora had lost the trail somewhere in the whiteout, and that instead of pushing on blindly, she had made the textbook choice, stopping, getting out of the wind, and trying to shelter until she could see well enough to move again. It was the right call. It simply was not enough. The temperature kept dropping through the afternoon and into the night, and the cold took her within a few hours of the moment she had stepped away from her own car. She left a plan. She stopped when she got lost, and she tried to shelter and wait it out. The fact that she did almost everything right and the cold still won just breaks my heart. For her family, the recovery was both a mercy and a cruelty. They had her back within the week, spared the bottomless, not knowing that swallows so many of these cases, and yet they were left holding the one question that would never have an answer: why the most careful person any of them had ever known went out that one morning against the very forecast she would have told anyone else to respect. In the season since, they have become quiet, insistent voices for the least glamorous rule in the backcountry, that a plan and a turnaround time count for nothing if you will not honor the weather. If there is one thread running through all 5 of these, it is how little it takes and how fast it happens. A few steps off a trail, into the fog, a barefoot minute in the dark, a quiet man slipping away from a picnic table, a single jump into a pretty pool. One afternoon that turned to snow. None of these people were fools, and most of them were better prepared than the average person who drives into that park on a weekend. Not one of them died doing something daring. They died in the smallest, most ordinary moments. A few steps, a wrong turn, a single jump, And that's what I would want you to remember the next time something feels easy. On August 19th, 2017, Glacier National Park was in the middle of its busiest season. The parking lots near Logan Pass filled up early, hikers packed the Highline Trail, and the cool mountain air sat in the low 60s despite the middle of August. The skies were clear, the visibility stretched for miles, and it looked like the perfect day to be in the mountains. Among the hikers that morning was Kenji Sato, a 46-year-old architectural photographer from Kyoto. For more than 20 years, he had built a career photographing temples, museums, historic libraries, and quiet courtyards before the crowds arrived. He wasn't interested in dramatic shots or risky viewpoints. Friends said Kenji could spend half an hour moving a tripod only a few inches because he believed the strongest photographs came from patience, not spectacle. Away from work, Kenji lived just as quietly. Friends said he preferred long train rides, simple meals, and walking alone with a camera. That independence made him easygoing in everyday life, but it also meant he trusted himself to solve problems without asking for help. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder if that same habit followed him onto the mountain. A former assistant later told investigators that Kenji trusted his own judgment more than almost anyone she'd worked with. It made him calm under pressure and easy to work alongside, but it also meant he rarely looked for help when he thought he could solve a problem himself. Looking back, that habit would matter far more than anyone realized. About a year before the trip this story is about, Kenji went in for a routine eye exam. And this is the part that completely changed how I looked at this story. Nothing urgent, just a checkup he'd put off for years. The ophthalmologist found something in the early stages, a progressive retinal disease, slow-moving, not immediately dangerous, but permanent. Over time, doctors told him he would lose the fine detail in his vision. The subtle contrast and shadow his entire career, not blindness, not right away, and maybe not ever completely. Kenji didn't talk about it much, according to people close to him. Not with most friends, and not in much detail even with his wife. He processed things quietly, the way he composed a photograph, slowly and mostly alone. But somewhere in that quiet processing, he made himself a promise. Before his eyesight changed for good, he was going to see the places he'd always wanted to see, with his own eyes, while his own eyes could still tell him the truth about what was in front of them. At the top of that list was Glacier National Park in Montana. He'd seen photographs of it for years, and colleagues say he talked about the quality of light there the way other people talk about a place they've already visited, even though he never had. There was an irony in the trip, and Kenji noticed it himself. The glaciers he wanted to photograph were disappearing. Most were expected to be gone within a generation. A fellow photographer later recalled him saying it plainly. If both the glaciers and his eyesight are fading, he'd like to see them before either one is gone. You know what's heartbreaking? The people closest to Kenji actually told him not to do this alone. Friends who heard about the trip suggested he bring someone along, or at least hire a local guide. His wife raised the idea more than once before he left, saying she'd feel better if he wasn't hiking unfamiliar mountain trails by himself. Kenji listened, but he didn't change the plan. He told her what he'd always said. He worked better alone. Having someone else there meant rushing shots or feeling guilty for making someone wait while the light changed. His wife later told investigators she'd considered pushing harder but didn't. After 20 years of marriage, she knew that once Kenji had made up his mind, arguing rarely changed it. Kenji arrived in Montana 3 days before his hike, staying at the Many Glacier Hotel. Hotel staff noted his meticulous nature. He routinely left handwritten itineraries at the front desk, detailing his planned trails, photo stops, and expected return times. He also kept a copy of his itinerary and the hotel's phone number in his backpack, a habitual safety precaution he performed as naturally as locking a car door. His backpack matched that same preparation. Investigators who later examined its contents found 2 weather-sealed cameras, spare batteries, printed national park trail maps with sections highlighted in pen, a downloaded offline park map on his phone, extra layers of clothing, food, water, and a basic first aid kit. Clipped to the shoulder strap was a satellite emergency messenger, a device about the size of a phone that can send a distress signal from almost anywhere, even where there's no cell service at all. By every standard a park ranger uses to judge a hiker, Kenji checked every box. Prepared, experienced, patient. There was only one box his preparation couldn't check. Someone else there if something went wrong. The 2 days before the hike, Kenji mostly stayed close to the hotel. Staff remembered him sitting on the porch in the early morning with a cup of coffee, watching the light on the mountains across the lake, sometimes with a camera in his lap, sometimes without one at all.
On the second evening, he went over his maps at a table near the lobby, checking mileage and elevation gain, marking a few spots where he thought the light might be good in the afternoon. A front desk clerk later told investigators that Kenji asked her, almost in passing, what time sunset was expected that week, whether the Logan Pass parking area usually filled up early, whether the park shuttle was running on schedule that time of year, and whether the Highline Trail tended to be busy on weekdays. She told him it usually was, but never overcrowded, and explained where the first shuttle pickups would be if parking became full. He thanked her, wrote the times down in a small notebook, and seemed satisfied with the answer. On the morning of August 19th, Kenji woke early, ate breakfast alone in the hotel dining room, and drove to the trailhead parking area a little after 7. A parking attendant who checked cars in that morning remembered him because he took several minutes at his trunk, laying out his gear on a towel before packing his bag, checking each camera body, wiping down the lenses, testing the tripod legs one at a time. The attendant said it looked less like someone packing for a hike and more like someone preparing equipment for a job, careful and unhurried. Kenji set out for the Highline Trail a little before 8, one of the most well-known routes in the park, mostly because it runs along a ridge with views stretching for miles. The weather that morning was about as good as it gets. Clear sky, comfortable temperature, visibility for miles in almost every direction. Rangers on duty that day later confirmed there were no weather advisories and no unusual trail conditions reported anywhere along the route. The trail was busy that morning. Not crowded, but busy enough that hikers passed each other every few minutes, with long stretches in between where a person could walk for 10 or 15 minutes without seeing anyone else at all. Kenji moved at his own pace, well behind most groups, stopping often, checking his map, watching the sky. Several hikers later gave statements to investigators, and many remembered Kenji because he moved differently from everyone else. One couple recalled watching him wait beside his tripod for several minutes until the light shifted across a distant glacier. A park volunteer also remembered speaking with a photographer who asked about the trail ahead. She warned him that the section near Haystack Butte narrowed and that loose shale near the edge could shift underfoot. She said he thanked her, listened carefully, and continued on. Like everyone else who saw him that day, she thought nothing of it until investigators contacted her afterward. By early afternoon, Kenji had covered a little more than half the trail, well behind schedule compared to a typical hiker, but exactly on pace with the itinerary he had left at the front desk that morning. He stopped for a short lunch around noon, sitting on a flat rock a short distance off the main path, eating a sandwich he had packed at the hotel and drinking from one of his water bottles. Another hiker passing at the time exchanged a brief greeting with him, noting nothing unusual, just a man eating lunch alone with a good view in front of him. Around 2:30 that afternoon, another hiker, also a photographer, crossed paths with Kenji near a stretch of trail called Haystack Butte. In his statement to investigators, he said the overlook there offers one of the best views on the whole trail, but the path narrows considerably at that point. The surface was mostly packed dirt, broken up in places by loose shale, thin sheets of rock that shift easily underfoot, especially near the edge. Beyond that edge, the mountainside dropped through a series of rock ledges before falling hundreds of feet into the valley. The witness said he watched Kenji switch out a lens, kneeling beside his open camera bag, while the tripod stood a few feet away, with the other body still mounted. He said it was a routine thing to see. Hikers change lenses on that overlook all the time, since it's one of the few flat spots wide enough to lay out a bag. The two men exchanged a wave. Neither said anything more. The witness continued down the trail toward the next overlook, thinking nothing of it. This is the moment that stayed with me the longest. Everything you're about to hear happened in less than a few seconds. He didn't know it then, and he told investigators later that he still thinks about it, but he had just become the last person to see Kenji Sato alive. By then, nobody on the trail realized that within the next few minutes, one ordinary movement would leave Kenji stranded only a few dozen feet below one of the busiest hiking trails in the park. What happened over the next few minutes was reconstructed afterward, mostly from footage recovered from Kenji's own camera, along with the physical evidence found at the scene. According to the investigation, the mounted camera had been running a static landscape recording for almost 40 minutes by that point, capturing the slow movement of cloud shadows across the valley below. It happened to still be running when the accident occurred, and the final minute of that recording is what tells the rest of the story. Investigators believe Kenji had placed his open camera bag on a gentle slope beside the trail while changing lenses. At some point, a small memory card case rolled away toward the edge. The footage shows Kenji turn toward the sound. He moved quickly toward the rolling case, the way almost anyone would, a fast, unthinking reach to stop a piece of equipment from going over the edge. It's a motion investigators say they've seen described in other incident reports involving hikers and dropped gear, usually with no consequence at all, since most hikers catch the item or simply let it go and step back onto solid ground. He caught the case, but the next step landed on a flat sheet of loose shale that suddenly shifted beneath his boot. With his weight already moving forward, there was nothing solid left to recover onto. The camera kept recording from its tripod a few feet away as Kenji went over the edge. The footage shows only the edge of the frame catching his fall, a blur crossing the bottom corner of the shot, before the image returns to its steady view of the valley, unchanged. The recording continued uninterrupted, showing the same mountain landscape for the rest of the file. Investigators later estimated the fall lasted between 2 and 3 seconds, based on the timestamps and measured distance to the impact site. Here's the part almost nobody expects. The fall didn't actually kill him. Search teams later determined that Kenji had not fallen all the way to the valley floor. He landed on a narrow rock shelf, roughly 35 feet below the main trail, a ledge covered almost completely by dense alpine shrubs. From above, on the trail, investigators confirmed there was no way to see it. It looked from that angle like part of the slope, indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. The medical examiner's report, filed by Flathead County, found the initial impact caused a shattered left femur, a fractured pelvis, and several broken ribs, some of which punctured his left lung. Internal bleeding began almost immediately, but the report also concluded, based on physical evidence at the scene, that Kenji likely remained conscious for some period after the fall. Investigators pointed to specific evidence on the ledge to support that conclusion. Long scrape marks in the dirt and rock showed where he had tried more than once to pull himself toward a flatter section of the shelf. Blood was found several feet from where he first landed, consistent with movement after impact rather than a single point of contact. Fragments of shale were recovered from beneath his fingernails, consistent with gripping at the rock face, trying to find something to hold onto or pull himself along by. A few yards from where he lay was his backpack, separated from him during the fall and out of his reach. Still clipped to one of its shoulder straps was the satellite emergency messenger, the one piece of equipment on him that could have called for help. Investigators noted that the device would have been visible from where he was lying, based on the position of the two objects when they were found. But with a shattered pelvis and a broken femur, there was no way for him to close that distance. That evening, hotel staff noticed Kenji hadn't returned by the time listed on his itinerary. They pulled the note from the front desk and called park rangers right away, giving them the exact trail and rough timeline Kenji had written down that morning. Search crews began early the next day. Helicopters flew the length of the trail. Ground teams worked the ridgeline, checking every overlook and switchback along the route, cross-referencing witness sightings as hikers came forward. Rangers also contacted the last several hikers known to have used the trail that day, which is how investigators eventually located and interviewed the photographer who had exchanged a wave with Kenji near Haystack Butte, along with the couple, the volunteer, and the solo hiker who had spoken with him earlier in the day. Search coordinators later said the biggest challenge wasn't finding people willing to search, it was narrowing down where to look along a trail more than 7 miles long, with steep drop-offs on one side for much of its length. Search dogs were brought in on the second day, along with additional helicopter passes focused specifically on the section between Haystack Butte and the next major junction, based on the itinerary Kenji had left and the approximate time he was thought to have passed through that area. Now, imagine this for a second. People were walking only a few dozen feet above him, and none of them knew he was there. Dozens of hikers passed along the Highline Trail over the following 2 days, most of them with no idea that a man was lying injured on a hidden ledge somewhere below them. Search coordinators later explained why no one heard him. Wind moves constantly through those cliffs, and the distance between the trail and that hidden shelf was enough that a shout from below wouldn't carry, or would carry so faintly it sounded like nothing at all, easy to mistake for wind or a distant bird. The shrubs covering the ledge did the rest, hiding him from anyone looking down from above, even searchers who knew roughly where to look. It wasn't until the third day that a helicopter crew spotted something out of place, an unattended backpack lodged against pale rock well below the trail. Rope rescue technicians were lowered down the cliff face to investigate. They found Kenji a short distance from his pack. The Flathead County medical examiner ruled the death accidental. The report listed the fractured pelvis, the shattered femur, the broken ribs, and a collapsed left lung caused by rib fragments, along with significant internal bleeding in the abdomen and chest. One line in that report stands out from the rest. Examiners concluded that none of Kenji's injuries taken individually would have caused death right away. Based on the evidence at the scene, they believed he survived for several hours after the fall, likely conscious for at least part of that time, before he died from hemorrhagic shock and complications from his chest injuries. Park rangers reconstructed the accident from every angle available to them, using the recovered footage, the witness statements gathered over those 3 days, and the physical evidence at the scene. Investigators measured the distance between the point where Kenji's boot print was found in the shale and the edge of the trail, and matched it against the position of the small case still sitting on the trail in the footage, confirming exactly how far he had moved to reach it. They also reviewed maintenance and trail condition logs for that section of the highline, confirming that the loose shale near Haystack Butte had been noted in prior seasons, but had not been considered severe enough to warrant additional signage or a barrier. The weather had been fine the entire time. The trail itself was in good condition and had no unusual hazards beyond the loose shale already known to be present near that overlook, a hazard marked on some trail maps but easy to overlook in practice. There was no wildlife involved and no evidence of foul play of any kind. The recovered video made one thing clear to investigators. Kenji never left the trail on purpose, and he never did anything reckless. He didn't lean over the edge for a better shot or ignore a warning sign. He did something almost every hiker on that trail does at some point: react fast when something starts sliding away from them. It's the kind of instinct nobody thinks twice about, right up until the ground underneath it happens to give way. Several of the witnesses interviewed said as much when asked, that they'd made the exact same kind of grab for a dropped item themselves, on that same trail, without a second thought. This is probably the biggest misconception people have when they hear stories like this. The investigation reached one practical conclusion. If another person had been hiking with Kenji, rescuers likely would have known where to search within minutes instead of days. A companion could have reported the fall immediately, or activated the satellite emergency messenger that landed only a short distance away. Search and rescue personnel later said accidents like this are a reminder that surviving the fall is sometimes only the beginning. In the months that followed, portions of the recovered footage were used in the park's seasonal safety briefings, shown to volunteer search and rescue teams, and included in materials for photography workshops held on site. Rangers have said the case gets used to make a point a lot of experienced hikers don't fully appreciate until it's explained to them plainly. Not every fall in the mountains kills a person right away. Sometimes the fall is only the beginning, and sometimes the real danger isn't the height or the rock, it's having no one there afterward to call for help. Park officials also reviewed signage near Haystack Butte after the investigation closed, and in the following season added a small marker warning hikers about loose rock near the overlook, along with a reminder to stay clear of the trail edge while using camera equipment. Search and rescue coordinators said the case became part of their basic training material for new volunteers, specifically as an example of how a hidden ledge can defeat even a well-organized search for several days. Back in Kyoto, Kenji's wife later donated one of his completed landscape photographs to the small gallery that had previously displayed his work. She later said she often thought back to the conversations before the trip when she'd suggested he bring someone along. She didn't blame him for going alone, she simply wished he hadn't. Kenji packed carefully for almost every problem the mountains could have thrown at him. Extra food, warm clothing, maps, first aid supplies, even a satellite emergency messenger. The only thing he couldn't pack was another person. According to the evidence gathered during the investigation, that may have been the one thing that could have changed the outcome. That's the part that stuck with me. Kenji planned for almost everything: food, maps, warm clothes, even an emergency messenger. But the one thing that might have saved his life wasn't something you can buy or pack into a backpack. It was another person. Most of them have no idea it was taken only minutes before the man who made it disappeared beneath one of the busiest trails in America. Kenji traveled halfway around the world to see something before it faded: the glaciers, his own eyesight, both fading on their own timelines. In the end, according to the people who investigated it, it wasn't the mountain that made the accident fatal. It was facing it alone. Rangers who worked the case have said in the years since that they still think about the timeline. 3 days between the fall and the discovery, when the fall itself may have left him alive for only a handful of hours. It's a gap that has nothing to do with how prepared Kenji was, or how experienced he was, or how carefully he had planned his trip down to the notes he left at a hotel front desk each morning. It has to do with a single fact that no amount of preparation could change. He was the only person who knew exactly where he was standing when the ground gave out. It was the 30th of July, 2016, and the low country sat under a heavy, breathless heat, the kind of afternoon that sends everyone looking for moving water. The Smokies are laced with hundreds of miles of cold, fast creeks, and one of the most beloved of them spills over a low waterfall into a deep green pool where people have cooled off for generations, a gorge that quietly gathers everything that falls on the high country above it. Levi Prophet, 22 and a Sevier County local, drove up that afternoon with a group of friends to do exactly that. The lot was full, and the flat rocks above the pool were crowded with people cooling off in the spray. It is exactly the kind of place that feels about as dangerous as a backyard pool. What none of them knew, and what almost no one ever thinks to check, was that slow-moving thunderstorms had been drenching the high ground upstream for much of that morning. The pool in front of them looked flat and gorgeous and inviting. Under the surface, the creek feeding it was running far higher, far colder, and far more powerful than it had any right to be, all that upstream rain funneling down through the gorge toward them. Levi was a strong swimmer, a former lifeguard even, the last person in the group anyone would have worried about, and that is exactly the profile these pools tend to claim. Confident young men who have jumped into 100 safe swimming holes and have no reason to believe this one is any different. I've covered a lot of wild country on this channel, and this park unsettles me more than most. It's not a danger you can see, it's how gentle it all looks right until it takes someone. Levi went in the way young men always have there, with a whoop and a running jump off the rocks into the deep water below the falls. He surfaced once, laughing, shaking the water out of his hair. And then the current no one could see took hold of him and pulled him straight down against the undercut base of the rock, into the churning, recirculating hydraulic that forms below a waterfall in high water, the kind of trap that will hold even a strong swimmer under and simply refuse to let go. He did not come back up. One moment he was laughing in the sun, and the next, the green surface had closed over the spot where he had been. One of his friends had been filming the jump on a phone, the way friends always do, and that footage became the hardest single piece of evidence in the case. On it, the surface of the pool looks almost gentle, glittering in the afternoon light. There is the jump and the laugh, and then just the smooth green water closing over the place where he had been, giving away absolutely nothing, while off camera you can hear the precise instant the laughing turns into screaming. His friends did everything right, and none of it changed anything. They could not get to him against that current without being pulled under themselves, and there was no cell signal down in the gorge, so one of them had to sprint back to the cars and drive out until he finally caught a cell signal and could call for help, while the others waited helplessly at the edge of the water, staring at a pool that had gone calm and pretty again as though nothing had happened at all. A swiftwater rescue team from the National Park Service worked the pool and the creek below it for 3 days. That swimming hole had a quiet history most of the summer crowds never knew. Locals had been wary of it for years, because it had taken people before, always in the same way and always after rain up high, and the faded warning signs posted near the trail and the swimming area had long since become part of the scenery. The danger there is invisible by design. Below a waterfall in high water, the plunging current digs into the rock and folds back on itself into what rescuers call a hydraulic, a churning, recirculating loop that will pull a swimmer down, spin them under, and hand them back to the same trap again and again no matter how strong they are. From the surface, none of that shows. The pool looks like glass. And because a hydraulic only strengthens with flow, a spot that is perfectly safe on a dry afternoon can turn lethal a few hours after a storm the swimmers never even saw. Divers could not safely enter the churn while the water stayed high. So much of the first 2 days was spent simply waiting for the upstream flow to fall, a brutal thing to ask of a family standing at the edge of the same pretty water that had taken their son. People look at a still pool on a hot day and see a postcard. What I see nowadays is the one thing that you can never read from the surface, which is what the water is hiding underneath. Levi's body was recovered 3 days later, well downstream, pinned in a jumble of logs and rock. The medical examiner ruled an accidental drowning. He had been in the water for less than a minute, in a spot where thousands of people swim happily every summer, and the only thing that had changed that day was rain none of them ever saw falling, on high ground miles away. In the seasons since, the park replaced aging warning signs and updated the hazard messaging for that pool. And Levi's friends have spoken openly about the one thing they wish someone had told them, that after a storm, the prettiest water in the park is very often the water most likely to kill you. On the 3rd of October 2020, A trail maintenance crew was clearing storm damage in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. They were working about 70 yards below the Alum Cave Trail after a powerful windstorm a few days earlier had toppled several large hemlock trees across the hillside. While cutting through one of the fallen trunks, a crew member noticed a patch of faded orange fabric partially buried beneath wet leaves and broken branches. At first, he figured it was just an old tarp or abandoned camping gear left behind years earlier. But as another worker started pulling away the debris, he spotted something pale, curved, and unmistakably human protruding from the forest floor. It's bone. And at that point, this stops being a cleanup job. Rangers and a forensic team arrived within a couple of hours. What they found were the weathered remains of a collapsed two-person emergency bivvy, almost completely buried beneath years of leaf litter, fallen branches, and storm debris. Much of the campsite had blended back into the surrounding forest, making it difficult to recognize until the debris was cleared away. Around the collapsed shelter, investigators recovered weathered camping equipment that had remained generally concentrated within the small campsite. A deteriorated backpack still held several personal belongings, including Arthur's wallet, phone, camera, whistle, and handheld GPS unit. Nearby were 2 water bottles, open food packaging, and a backpacking stove connected to a fuel canister. Although years of weather, moisture, insects, and natural decay had affected many of the items, enough remained in place for investigators to reconstruct the basic layout of the campsite. Despite years of exposure, investigators did not find the kind of widespread scattering of equipment they would normally associate with a violent large animal attack. That did not rule one out entirely, but the surviving scene did not strongly support it either. Over the years, repeated storms, seasonal leaf fall, and natural forest growth gradually concealed what remained of the campsite. Dense rhododendron, uneven terrain, and downed hemlocks hid the area from hikers on the trail, while the accumulation of debris likely reduced how easily scavenging animals could locate it. By the time it was discovered, very little of the original campsite remained visible above the forest floor. The medical examiner found no surviving skeletal injuries that clearly established a fatal fall or violent assault. However, the condition of the remains meant that many soft tissue injuries, including a snake bite, superficial animal wounds, or other medical emergencies, could no longer be evaluated. Dental records and the earlier missing person investigation identified the remains as Arthur Kessler, 41, and his daughter Lily Kessler, age 9. They had been reported missing on September 15, 2015, after failing to return from what was supposed to be an overnight hike toward Mount LeConte. For 5 years, nobody had answers. They had disappeared less than 100 yards from one of the busiest hiking trails in the entire national park system. Investigators finally had their bodies, but they still didn't know how either of them had died. Before anybody could theorize about what killed them, they had to nail down what was actually known. Not guessed, not assumed, just what the evidence backed up. Arthur's gray Honda CR-V was found in the Alum Cave parking area after he and Lily were reported missing. A parking receipt associated with the vehicle placed their arrival at approximately 8:47 that morning. Another hiker later reviewed the missing person bulletin and provided a photograph taken near the trailhead. Arthur and Lily appeared in the background, confirming that they had started the hike together. Arthur was wearing a green rain shell, while Lily carried a small purple day pack. Weather conditions were favorable at the trailhead, with temperatures expected to reach 68 degrees, while the forecast called for overnight lows in the mid-40s near Mount LeConte's 6,593-foot summit. No rain was expected until sometime the following afternoon. Quick gut check here, because this becomes important later. Nothing about that morning looked unusual. The weather was good, they had the right gear, and they started at a normal time. This isn't one of those stories where you can immediately point to one obvious mistake. Arthur's phone, recovered inside his backpack, showed a final text message sent to his sister at 10:52 that morning, letting her know the hike was going well and that they expected to reach the summit by mid-afternoon. After that, the phone recorded no successful communication. That silence did not establish when an emergency began, since cellular coverage becomes unreliable along portions of the trail. His camera still contained photographs from Arch Rock, about 1.5 miles up the trail, taken at 11:20, and another from Alum Cave Bluffs, roughly 2.25 miles in, taken at 1:05 that afternoon. The skies were clear in both photographs, and neither Arthur nor Lily appeared to be in any visible distress. That image, taken at 1:05, became the last confirmed evidence placing them on the trail. Investigators later interviewed hikers who had been in the area that afternoon, but no one could confidently remember seeing Arthur and Lily beyond the bluffs. Investigators also looked closely at Arthur's hiking experience to determine whether poor preparation had played any role. Receipts from a local outfitter showed he had purchased a handheld GPS unit, a compass, trekking poles, and a two-person emergency bivvy about 3 months before the trip. Friends described him as an intermediate hiker who had completed several day hikes in the Smokies over the previous couple of years, including one earlier attempt on the same trail that ended before reaching the summit. His backcountry permit had been properly filed for one night near LeConte Lodge before hiking back down the following day. Lily had joined him on several shorter hikes that year, but had never spent a night in the backcountry at that elevation. But none of that raised any immediate concerns. The permit was in order, the equipment was appropriate, and the forecast gave no reason to cancel the trip. On paper, Arthur had done everything people tell you to do before heading into the backcountry. That's what makes this case so deceptive. If you're trying to figure out where everything started going wrong, you're not going to find the answer here. There isn't an obvious mistake, a reckless shortcut, or a warning they ignored. Investigators would spend years trying to identify that one turning point, and they never found one. The Alum Cave Trail climbs roughly 2,763 feet over 5.5 miles, with its steepest section beginning above the bluffs, where steel cables are anchored into the rock to help hikers navigate exposed terrain. Beyond that point, the forest begins to thin. Wind exposure increases, and temperatures can drop dramatically compared to the trailhead. It's a demanding hike, but it's also one of the most popular in the Great Smoky Mountains, with thousands of people reaching the summit safely every year. Rangers say temperature swings of more than 20 degrees between the base of the mountain and the summit are completely normal, and hikers often underestimate how quickly conditions change once they gain elevation. Even so, nothing about the trail, the weather, or Arthur's level of preparation suggested this trip would end any differently than countless others. At that point, there was simply no reason for anyone to think something had gone terribly wrong. When the Kesslers were reported overdue on the 16th, search teams began with the explanation that solves most missing hiker cases in this kind of terrain. They had wandered off the trail and become disoriented. Honestly, it was a reasonable place to start. The Alum Cave Trail is well marked, but there are stretches, especially above the bluffs, where dense rhododendron can block visibility so completely that the trail disappears within just a few steps. If someone left the path, even by accident, they could quickly lose their sense of direction. Search crews spent the first 6 days concentrating on drainages, steep slopes, and ravines, the places where lost or injured hikers are most often found. The problem was, Arthur and Lily weren't in any of those places. When Arthur's backpack was documented at the discovery site in 2020, investigators found a paper topographic map, a compass, and a handheld GPS unit among the recovered equipment. Investigators attempted to recover the stored track from the handheld GPS unit. If the surviving data was complete and reliable, it showed Arthur and Lily following the marked trail before making a short, direct movement toward the area where the campsite was later found. The track did not show the long loops or repeated backtracking, often associated with someone wandering extensively through unfamiliar terrain. However, it could not reveal why they left the trail, whether every part of their movement had been recorded, or whether they became disoriented after reaching the campsite. The GPS evidence therefore weakened the theory that they had spent hours lost deep in the forest, but it did not eliminate every form of disorientation. So, theory 1 out. Whatever happened to them, it didn't start with getting lost. The next theories came directly from the setting. This was black bear country, and part of the Alum Cave Trail crossed steep, exposed terrain. Investigators therefore considered a large animal encounter, a venomous snake bite, or an accidental fall from one of the nearby ledges. The scene did not strongly support any of those explanations. Investigators found no fractures in the skull, spine, or long bones that clearly indicated a fatal fall. The surviving gear showed no obvious tearing, puncture damage, or widespread disturbance consistent with a violent bear attack. Examiners also found no identifiable bite or claw damage on the remains that could be confidently attributed to a large animal. But after 5 years outdoors, this could never be treated as a perfect elimination. Decomposition, insects, small scavengers, water movement, falling debris, and repeated freezing and thawing could all damage the remains or obscure evidence that had once been present. Soft tissue injuries, including a snake bite or superficial animal wounds, would have been especially difficult or impossible to identify. The bivvy's condition condition also complicated the bear theory. It was still largely closed, but it had collapsed beneath leaves, branches, and storm debris, making the campsite less visible and possibly limiting how easily a large scavenger could reach it. The scene did not support a bear attack or a fatal fall, though investigators could not absolutely exclude every possibility after 5 years of exposure. For that reason, wildlife and traumatic injury were considered unsupported rather than conclusively impossible. This was the theory that grabbed all the attention. After the discovery became public in October 2020, reporters focused on a small, unofficial spring about 40 yards from the campsite. It was not marked on official trail maps, and its history of use by hikers could not be firmly established from the campsite evidence alone. Investigators also found both of Arthur's water bottles nearby. One was empty, while the other still contained some liquid that could potentially be examined. Honestly, at this point, I probably would have blamed the water too. It seemed to explain everything. 2 people leave the trail, camp near an untreated spring, suddenly become sick, and never make it back out. It's the kind of theory that feels right before you even look at the evidence. Unsurprisingly, many of the early news reports suggested contaminated water might be responsible. Samples collected from the spring after the campsite was discovered could describe the water in 2020, but they could not recreate its exact condition on the day Arthur and Lily disappeared 5 years earlier. Seasonal runoff, wildlife, rainfall, and changes upstream could all have altered the source during that period. The later testing did not identify an obvious toxic contaminant that independently explained 2 deaths. However, it could not prove that the spring had been harmless in September 2015, establish whether either hiker drank from it, or rule out a temporary contamination event that was no longer present. The spring therefore remained a possible source of ordinary illness, but the evidence was too limited to identify it as the cause or dismiss it completely. More importantly, the water theory alone did not explain why both hikers died at the campsite. So now investigators were left with a scene that supported several possibilities but confirmed none of them. Arthur and Lily were found inside a shelter about 70 yards from the trail. The surviving remains showed no skeletal trauma that clearly established a fatal fall. The campsite did not show the obvious pattern of a violent animal attack, and later spring samples revealed no clear toxin that explained both deaths. None of those findings completely eliminated the corresponding theories. Investigators went through the recovered equipment a second time, approaching it from a different angle. Instead of asking what caused their deaths, they started asking how each decision led them here. The first thing that stood out was the backpacking stove and its fuel canister. Both were found inside the collapsed emergency bivvy instead of outside. That was unusual because basic backpacking safety recommends cooking in a well-ventilated area. The fuel canister contained little usable fuel when recovered. That finding was consistent with the stove having been used, but 5 years of leakage, corrosion, valve damage, and temperature changes made it impossible to determine how much fuel had actually burned at the campsite. Fragments of freeze-dried meal packaging were also recovered. The opened packets showed that food had been handled or prepared after they stopped, but their condition after 5 years could not reveal how much Arthur or Lily had actually eaten. Together, the shelter, stove, food packaging, and water bottles established that they had created a temporary campsite. They didn't establish precisely how long they remained conscious or how much food and water they consumed. Investigators also found no evidence that either one had made it far from the campsite after the shelter was set up. No personal equipment or other belongings were recovered farther up the trail or elsewhere in the surrounding area, and no surviving evidence showed that one of them had traveled any significant distance to seek help. However, after 5 years of weather, decomposition, animal activity, and repeated seasonal changes, investigators could not determine with certainty whether either Arthur or Lily had briefly left the immediate campsite. Arthur's phone showed no successful activity after the message sent earlier that morning, which was consistent with the well-known stretch of the trail where cellular service disappears. In other words, the evidence simply went silent. A medical review of the scene considered whether an acute illness might have caused Arthur and Lily to stop before reaching their destination. Gastrointestinal illness, dehydration, exhaustion, cold exposure, and an unrelated medical emergency were among the possible explanations. However, the recovered packaging and bottles could not reliably show how much they had eaten or drunk, and the later spring testing could not rule out the condition of the water 5 years earlier. No surviving medical evidence identified a specific infection, poison, or illness. Illness could help explain why they established a campsite, but it could not be confirmed and did not by itself explain both deaths. And this next part is the piece that actually cracks the case open, at least as far as investigators could take it. Forensic examiners looked closer at the bivvy fabric itself. Although the campsite had been heavily altered by 5 years of exposure, enough of the surviving equipment remained near the collapsed bivvy for for investigators to identify the original campsite and begin reconstructing what had happened there. The bivvy model provided limited ventilation compared with an open cooking area, which made stove use inside it potentially dangerous. The valve's recovered position may have been consistent with the stove being left open, but corrosion, movement, and handling after 5 years prevented investigators from using that detail to reconstruct exactly when or how the stove stopped operating. Investigators also reopened the original search records for comparison. Available search records showed that teams covered likely travel routes, drainages, steep terrain, and areas where an injured hiker might have fallen or become trapped. The surviving records did not establish that the eventual campsite was deliberately excluded. Rather, the thick vegetation and uneven ground made a small shelter difficult to see even at close range. When you put all of that together, it becomes easier to understand how searchers covering miles of rugged terrain could miss a campsite less than 100 yards from the trail. The bivvy sat inside dense rhododendron beneath a stand of hemlocks, where the ground dipped away from the main path. As the shelter collapsed, seasonal leaf fall and fallen branches gradually covered it. Later storms added more debris, eventually making the bivvy resemble little more than a mound on the forest floor. That concealment may also explain why the remains were not obviously scattered by a large scavenger during the years before their discovery. Now, I want to be upfront about something here. What I'm about to walk you through is not confirmed fact. It's the most consistent sequence investigators could build from the physical evidence. That's it. Sometime after the photograph was taken at 1 o'clock that afternoon, Arthur and Lily left the marked trail and walked about 70 yards to the place where their remains would be discovered 5 years later. The GPS track showed a direct path rather than the aimless movement investigators typically associate with someone who is lost. That detail really stood out to investigators. One possibility is that illness, exhaustion, changing conditions, or another problem prompted Arthur to choose a sheltered location instead of continuing toward the summit or immediately descending. The campsite evidence does not reveal which of those possibilities drove the decision. The opened food, packaging, water bottles, stove, and shelter showed that they had stopped and begun using their camping equipment. Those objects could not establish whether either person was experiencing gastrointestinal illness or how much food and water they had consumed. By evening, temperatures at that elevation would have been falling. Arthur may have used the stove to prepare food, heat, water, or provide warmth. Its exact position while operating could not be reconstructed, although its association with the enclosed shelter raised the possibility of carbon monoxide exposure. One possible sequence is that Arthur operated the stove inside or too close to the bivvy while preparing food, heating, water, or trying to provide warmth. If the shelter was mostly closed, combustion gases could have accumulated in the confined space. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. Early exposure can cause headache, weakness, dizziness, confusion, and drowsiness, symptoms that might be mistaken for exhaustion, dehydration, altitude discomfort, cold, or illness. As exposure increased, both occupants could have become less able to recognize the danger, open the shelter, or shut down the stove. That sequence is consistent with the stove and shelter pattern, but it was never confirmed. Investigators could not determine how long the stove operated, how much ventilation the bivvy had at the time, whether the fuel loss occurred before or after the deaths, or what concentration of carbon monoxide, if any, developed inside. One detail kept coming up during the investigation. The surviving portion of the shelter appeared to have remained largely closed, and both Arthur and Lily were found inside rather than near its entrance. That did not definitively rule out an animal encounter, illness, or another emergency, especially after 5 years of decomposition and environmental exposure. Still, investigators found no surviving evidence of a violent struggle or a frantic attempt to force their way out. And here's why the title of this whole thing actually matters. The water became the most obvious early suspect, but the evidence never proved that it caused their deaths. Later testing could not recreate the spring's condition 5 years earlier, and the surviving bottle could not establish when or where it had been filled. Carbon monoxide offered another possible explanation because it has no color or smell and can build up around fuel-burning equipment in an enclosed space. But investigators could not prove that it was what killed Arthur and Lily. Here's where the case gets frustrating. By the time Arthur and Lily were found 5 years later, there simply wasn't enough left for medical examiners to perform the laboratory test that confirms carbon monoxide poisoning. That meant investigators could never prove the theory, no matter how well the evidence seemed to fit. Because of that, the official records never listed carbon monoxide as the cause of death. Instead, both causes of death were classified as undetermined, with the circumstances considered most consistent with an accidental event. Carbon monoxide exposure was one theory raised by the relationship between the stove and shelter. Illness, cold exposure, dehydration, or another medical emergency could not be confirmed or excluded. And I think that's what makes this case so haunting. There was no single piece of evidence that answered everything. Instead, investigators had to rebuild their final hours from a handful of clues: a GPS GPS track leading away from the trail, an almost empty fuel canister, a backpacking stove inside a cramped shelter, and water bottles that turned out to have nothing to do with their deaths. Sometimes, that's as close to the truth as an investigation can get. The medical examiner classified both deaths as undetermined, with the circumstances considered likely accidental. The discovery site established that Arthur and Lily had left the trail, set up their emergency shelter, and used or prepared to use camping equipment at that location. Because a fuel-burning stove was found with the enclosed shelter, carbon monoxide exposure became one possible explanation. However, investigators could not confirm that the stove had operated inside the bivvy long enough to produce a fatal concentration, and no surviving medical test could establish carbon monoxide poisoning. Illness, cold exposure, dehydration, and other medical emergencies also remained possible. The official finding did not identify a proven combination of causes. Because their remains weren't found until 5 years later, there was no way to scientifically confirm carbon monoxide poisoning, so the official cause of death remained undetermined, likely accidental. And that's what makes this case so unsettling. There wasn't one catastrophic mistake. It was a series of small, reasonable decisions that slowly stacked on top of each other. Choosing to stop instead of pushing on, running a stove inside a shelter while trying to stay warm, making those decisions while possibly exhausted, cold, ill, or under some other form of physical stress. None of those choices seemed extraordinary at the time. Together, they became fatal. The place where Arthur and Lily died was only about 70 yards off one of the busiest hiking trails in the Great Smoky Mountains. Search teams spent days working that corridor, and over the next 5 years, countless hikers unknowingly passed within a short walk of the campsite without ever seeing it. Dense hemlock cover, thick rhododendron, and uneven terrain already made the site difficult to see from the trail. Over time, the shelter collapsed into the forest floor as layers of leaves, branches, and storm debris accumulated over it. From the trail, little remained that would have stood out as a campsite, even to experienced hikers who never left the marked path. It's hard not to think about how close they were to being found. The clues that shaped the leading theory, the recoverable GPS track, the fuel canister, the stove, the bottles, and the collapsed shelter, didn't provide a clear answer individually or together. It was only after investigators viewed every piece of evidence together that a likely explanation finally emerged. No confirmed evidence presented in this case establishes that the National Park Service formally changed its warnings or search procedures because of Arthur and Lily's deaths. What the discovery does illustrate is how easily a small campsite can disappear in dense mountain vegetation, and why fuel-burning stoves should never be operated inside a closed shelter. It also shows that a missing person may stop only a short distance from a marked path rather than wandering miles into the wilderness.